Hello and welcome to another episode of the War Report, probably the shortest amount of pre-show conversation we had before. And while not as eventful as last episode, because we did have quite a bit to catch up on last episode, in which case I should mention Geo being there, absolute pleasure as always. We covered so much ground. I'm glad you all stuck it out for almost 4 hours. That was probably I think that's actually the longest episode we have on record. And you know what? It deserves the spot. It went well. It was received well, so I am glad that went well. We look forward to having Geo back, of course, in due time. But there's been some news over the past week. Like I said, don't expect as heavy as a show. We're probably just going to go around the standard 2.5 hours, even though, as I've learned from last episode, you people will put up with anything, so perhaps I should drag it out a little longer. But I suppose once again we should start. We always start with the forgotten war of Ukraine,
Yes.
and you'll give us the nitty gritty details, and we can get into it.
Okay. Yeah. So, why don't we start with an overall picture of the fighting that is happening? Again, it's mostly in the Donbass. We'll get into Grinky and some of the strikes by the Russians as of late. So, here's an overall view of where the fighting is taking place. As you can see, it's in the eastern central area. And maybe one of the most important areas. Let's go in a little deeper, I guess, is the Avdiivka Bakhmut area. This is where most of this fighting is happening, and I would say from last week, um, the overall picture is more gains by the Russians. This is across the battlefront. I would say pardon me. I would say, however, most of that is happening in this area from Bakhmut to Avdiivka, and then south of Avdiivka, Novomihailovka, and Marinka. That's where most of the gains have been. The Zaporozhye front I would say, it's kind of static. Most of the fighting that was happening around the Orehov Rabotino salient, that has stopped. It has been unchanged in like you know we can talk about a field, a tree line that has been taken, then lost and retaken, but the overall picture of that salient remains almost entirely unchanged, probably since September. Um, then there's Krinky, which is in Kherson. This was um, an interesting battle. We'll get back to the hotter spots, as I was saying, but let's take a look at what Krinky was back in November 12th, and what Krinky is now on December 12th. And this is what I mean about unchanged. But uh, I meant to mention this when we had Geo on the show. Um, there was an article that came about. I'm trying to remember whether it was the New York Times or the Washington Post, but uh, they had um, they had a Ukrainian soldier talk about what fighting was like at Krinky in
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
Kherson.
that was the post.
That was the post. Yes. Okay. So I meant to bring it up last week, but I didn't get the chance. So what there's several things about it that are very interesting in this article, because one of them, and of course, History of Legends did an amazing show on Krinky and what the development is there. And the maps I sent you are from him. So there was a battalion commander that was interviewed, and he mentioned that um, from the fighting in Kherson in 2022 till now. He has had, and remember, that's about 400 men. He's had to have the battalion replaced at least twice. But this dovetailed something with something very interesting because I'll tell you what. Again, to stick with Kherson, not necessarily the area of Krinky, but just a few kilometers over the river of the Dnieper, and further into the area where the Russians used to control. Remember how we talked about Russia having using their expensive jets to like do low level flying and bombing, and I think I mean Western press didn't want to talk about it until much later, but when the Ukrainians were taking back Kherson, we were talking about um, how many men the Ukrainians had lost in order to take Kherson, and a few articles popped up, and that guy uh, Ilya Ponomarenko, he brought it up. He's remember him. He said um, people are very happy about Kherson, but they don't talk about how it took us 10,000 men to take it. So why do I bring this up? Because I think a lot of things have changed, right? The Russians at that time were using bombs that were at least as powerful or more powerful, but they were also more accurate. Um, this week they released a video, as I was saying, that demonstrated this again, right? And what has happened is since the fall of 2022, the Russians enjoyed doing, this kind of close up aerial support because they did actually take out most of, but not all of, Ukrainian air defense, right? And if we're talking about Kherson, the Kherson falls a month after the first attack on the Crimean Bridge, the Kerch Bridge. So that close air support, because this video demonstrated how this. I don't know if it was a Sukhoi 34, 35, might even have been the 57, but um, it's flying very low and it's dropping quite a payload, and these guys are getting, annihilated. Um, so that air support stopped, and what happened is, of course, the Russians had to revert to, or not even revert, but change their tactics to glide bombs. This gives the Ukrainians, as well as anybody else, if they have early warning systems, then they have a chance to escape a hit. Right. This sort of stuff is good for an accumulation of forces and material, but it's not the same thing as having close air support. So I thought that was interesting, because you have, both sides sometimes to minimize things that really shouldn't be minimized, and this isn't a game changer. That's not a game changer. Well, I mean, close air support is a thing, and maybe it's not a game changer, but and maybe a few more months of extra fighting isn't a game changer, but it certainly means something. It's not nothing, right? So, anyways, I thought that was interesting. So Krinky is, as you can see with the two maps, is not an area that has exchanged territory very much. Now, the Russians have not been capable of dislodging them, and then you have like really stupid statements by deep state in order to answer, like, why are you still there, when in this article he's talking about how high the casualties are in order to maintain this small strip of land. And deep state said, Krinky is about only one thing. It's about heroism. It's like, oh my god, it's just. I mean, it's okay. It's about heroism. You can still have heroism and do something more constructive. I don't know. I don't know what to say. So uh, it's interesting how the Ukrainians ended up taking this territory. Because like 8-9 kilometers uh, south and west of this area, around the Antonovsky Bridge. That's where the Russians had to destroy that bridge once they left the Kherson area. They've landed a party there. That party the Ukrainians have had there since June, and this what they did was a kind of a back and forth. Are we going to be in Krimki? Are we going to be around the Antonovsky Bridge? Like, which one is it? And they finally settled you know for Krimki. And like I say, the Russians have had a hard time. I told you, I think it was before I went to Istanbul. Um, they had that squad that was wiped out. Then they tried to dislodge them with heavier armor. Um, that got hit very hard. There were several columns. Reddit had a field day. They were hit 4 kilometers from the contact line. I think it was the Financial Post, if I'm not mistaken. They had an article saying that both sides in this area, including the Russians getting ambushed, had inexperienced troops. Now, the Russians hadn't lost as many men as the Ukrainians had at one point. So the reason Ukrainian men were untrained was because of the hurry to replace the losses. The Russians had untrained, or let's say they're trained, but they're not experienced, which is a big difference. They were put there basically because it was a quiet front. You know. Anyhow, I thought that was kind of interesting, especially how all these few facts kind of give us an idea of how the strategies have changed, right? That air defense systems that the Ukrainians have received have made a difference and forced the Russians to attack in a way that they haven't before, right? So that created the need for glide bombs. More articles have come out about how the Russians electronically are able to jam, pardon me, Ukrainian glide bombs. Uh, Another article, Ukrainians estimate that the Russians now have a 5-to-1 advantage over drones. And indeed, um, it sometimes looks like that, uh, like the future of war, watching this one evolve, is a question of having a drone for every man on the field. You know, in terms of cost and capabilities, like it almost feels like that might be a strategy. But let me return to some of the big stories that have been developing. So let's go to let's first of all get a view of the Donetsk front and what the ambitions of the Russians might be before, I don't know, before spring, or well into spring of 2024. So you can see in this image that we have Donetsk. You can see right above the word Donetsk is Avdiivka. That's a big front. And you can see the bottom arrow is Marinka. Now, the Russians have captured Marinka last week, but the northern part was still not captured. So I'm just sending you how the northern part was captured. This is either from today or yesterday. The interesting thing about Marinka is that Marinka is just there's one more town, I believe it's Nova Mihailovka, and after that, it's basically, and the Ukrainians have a stronghold there. But after that, it's Ugledar. And I was mentioning last week about the road systems um, that run through Ugledar. So here is again an image of Marinka, Nova Mihailovka, and Ugledar. This is an area the Ukrainians know very well is extremely important to hold. Okay, um, some people have claimed that this is sort of the the key to the lock that is Zaporozhye. You can see Ugledar is circled there. You see a highway that leads from Ugledar and goes all the way to Velika Novosilka. Those highways are important. You see, there's almost like an echo effect of highways the further west you go, going on a north-south axis, right? So a lot of fighting there. This is a really important area for the Russians to take. Um, fighting has been going on there since 2014. In a concerted way, you could say fighting has been going on for over 10 months in Marinka, not just on again, off again flashpoints. Then I'm going to show you some of the big gains that have been happening in Avdiivka. Um, what did I show you? The map of Avdiivka is in this picture. It's at the bottom. The city is mentioned in the bottom. So now we can get into the frontline news there. This is again the south. So you can see compared to last week, the Russians have spread quite a bit in the south. They've overtaken the industrial area, the heap. They've started going into the forested areas, and fighting is starting to take place in the first of the residential streets, just barely. Yasinovka Ulica is one such street, and there's the other one further west of it. This, I don't know if we've mentioned it, but um, some of the gains in this area around Avdiivka, I think we mentioned it before I went to Istanbul, but apparently the Russians, for three times now on the Avdiivka front, have tunneled their way. They did one on the southern flank of Avdiivka instead of, but the west side of the south, not the east side where this is. But they've done them usually in the southern part, where they've dug underground towards the Ukrainian positions, filled it with it's literally a World War I technique. Filled it with mines and blew up an opening and then stormed. I've actually seen a video of them do this and of the Russians doing this, and this is the third time that such a thing has been done by them. Let me show you. I'll just briefly show you how the Russians have been moving in Novomihailovka. Remember, I said that was just south of Marinka. After Novomihailovka is Zugladar. You can see some of the recent gains. This has been very heavy fighting, very difficult to hold on to. Um, sorry. Um, this is south of this next one is south of Marinka. So further south from there is the area I showed you, Novomihailovka. That's where the gains have been happening. Avdiivka, let me get uh, the overall view of Avdiivka. Um, yeah, what this let's do a topical. I was talking about the southern advances of the Russians, and you can see, the pink areas are where the heights are. So anybody who controls the southern part of Avdiivka has a height advantage. Um, Avdiivka proper is in a yellow area. That green and blue that you see is the lowest part of the terrain, and that's where a lot of forest and residential buildings are. So this is an area that, had there not been trees here, this would be an area that would not be easy to hold on to. But that gives you an idea of the look of the land there. And now there was territory that the Russians had gained. Yes, to the north. This is the northern part of Avdiivka. You can see that they've stepped over their. They at least control a portion of Stepove, and what they are going to want to do is create a crescent from the north all the way around Avdeevka. So the Russians have had steady progress in this area for sure. Just to bring up the media zona map for November. Remember, November, people were trying to say that November was like somehow astronomical in losses, unlike anything. Because, the Ukrainian channels were saying Russia lost, killed in action, over 1,200 people in the first days of the. And of course, none of it was true. I mean, yes, they have losses. Many of them are horrendous, and many of them, I think, maybe even avoidable. Avdiivka has not been easy for the Russians. They are making progress, but it has not been easy. As you can see, for November, 577 confirmed losses, media zona. You can find it on the BBC website. BBC actually pays for them. So um, it's, if anything, it's an average month um, on the lower side for the Russians. It's nothing like what we saw January of this year and May of this year. Those were very heavy months because, of course, the Russians were fighting very hard in Bakhmut. Now, if I can get mhm. So I'm gonna. So speaking of Bakhmut, let's get to Bakhmut. Um, Here's basically what the picture is like. So this is Bakhmut. Um, Aside from the intention arrows about how the Russians would want to take Ivanivske, Ivanivske is like part of that whole conglomerate that includes Chasov Yar. Chasov Yar is west of it, to be sure. It's in the almost in the top left hand pocket. But Ivanivske is the closest town next to Bakhmut. Now, everything from here to Chasov Yar is on elevated ground, so it is it's a place you would want. But I would think that Chasov Yar is a sizable town. Even Ivanivske will not be easy. The Russians came very close, attacking this town Ivanivske in the early part of this year from the south and from the east. This was almost all Wagner. Uh, Almost all of these initial gains that the Russian army is trying to retake now, all those gains were done by Wagner. Okay, so I'm going to now show you um, just some of the gains in the last few hours. They don't look like much, but every day has been these sorts of gains, bit by bit. I suppose if people watch the show over time, they'll see that there's areas that the Russians control right now on the western flank of Bakhmut that they never even controlled at the height of the war. And I'm talking about um, towns like Bogdanovka. Bogdanovka, the Russians are on the outskirts. They have captured that area of the 00506 highway, as you can see. This was the road of death. This is like last year we saw, not last year, but earlier part of this year, in the first half, we saw a lot of fighting here. This is like the trenches, the Ukrainians sending poison filled drones. Remember, this was one of the most horrific areas of battle that we've seen. The important thing to keep in mind is it took the Ukrainians from roughly, they began in late May, just before their summer offensive in Zaporozhye. They began an offensive to retake Bakhmut, according to them. And it took months for them to get to points where a few kilometers short of a few kilometers past where the Russians are now. But the Russians have taken this territory basically in the last week or two. So the gains for the Russians are happening at a faster pace, and even though places like Kupiansk, Svatove, Liman, the gains there for the Russians are very small, or like in Kupiansk and Svatove, they're very static. Nothing is really happening there. Like I say, Zaporozhye, almost nothing or very small gains around the Vremevsky ledge, like around the village of Priyutne. The Russians have improved their positions there. But if you look at the totality of the whole thing, you can't help but notice that, except for Krinky, and as you saw, Krinky, the Ukrainians have not managed to gain more ground. Um, it's the Russians that bit by bit are gaining more and more territory. Like if you compiled all the videos since the time before I left for Istanbul, you'll see that the gains, although sometimes modest, right? Some of them are a kilometer, represent an achievement of going a kilometer within like a 48-hour period, which for this war into what this war has become is actually significant. Um, I did have one image to show you. Uh, let's see. This is also more of the Bakhmut front, again on the western side, but also. Um, oh yes, these are one of the objectives. Now, in this photo, you remember last week I did have an image, but the image didn't highlight the canal system. This yellow line that you see is a canal system, and the theory goes that the Russians would like to push as far as this canal system because it acts like a border. The Russians did control part of this canal system to the south of the first red arrow that you see in the image. If that arrow intersects with the yellow line, south of that is where they control it. So this whole thing winds its way much further north towards Seversk. Um, it's a natural barrier. It's not like tanks and armored personnel carriers can't cross it. They can, but it is not an. It would take some time. Men can easily cross it with very little problems, with very few problems. But the point is that they would make themselves uh, noticed. Here's some more areas around Bakhmut which have been retaken. This is an area of the dachas which are right next to Bakhmut, but technically, for like civilian maps are not part of Bakhmut. I don't understand the ins and outs of that, but and the Russians have also been able to take now the territory around Klishevka. They have retaken all the ground north of Klishevka. So I'm just gonna keep posting more of this territory that the Russians have gaining around Bakhmut. As you know, more north of Klishevka is an area that has a very complex and large um, system of trenches and tunnels. The reason is, of course, it's on the highest part. Um, Here's our map of Klishevka, as you can see. So, anyways, the Russians have managed to take this area. Um, and it's very likely that if things keep progressing the way they have this week, all of Klishevka is not going to fall. And that's another example of an area that took months to get to for the Ukrainians, which is being undone in a few weeks, basically. And I think that's brought speculation about, well, what does that mean long term for the war? Like, what will the West do? Will the West panic? You're certainly seeing more rhetoric from Germany. Um, their military staff, even Schultz has hinted at, he mentioned today that the He's going to use the funds for the German public to finance Ukraine. So these people aren't nuts. Like they know they've gotten themselves into a death match with
Oh,
Russia.
absolutely. And I'm
Like,
I'm
go
I'm
ahead.
I'm glad you brought up the point about Germany because I was going to, after this, touch a bit on Zelensky's most recent visit to Washington. To say it's been one of many, and that what we see right now, combined with the news out of Germany and out of Poland, which I'll also get into with the new Tusk government taking power, with
Hmm.
Sikorsky, the man who openly celebrated the American destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline just 12 hours after it happened, around 12 hours. I know it was the same day.
Yes.
That it seems what the policy in Washington is right now is shifting more of the burden of supporting the war effort onto Europe as Biden moves into an election year, especially with the burgeoning conflict in the Middle East. And don't worry, we have plenty to cover with the Israel Palestine situation. Israel has stalled out in its offensive in Gaza. It hasn't called it off, but it's certainly stalled out. We'll get into that in due time, though. But
Yeah.
what I do think is what you consistently have with Biden bringing Zelensky over, with Zelensky's reception by Congress, with his demands, and with the ultimate $200 million package that walked away from. Keep in mind that's $200 million versus billions upon billions, which he's received as part of his other aid packages for "quote unquote" Ukraine. Even though I think we all know where the money's really going, but I digress. That this is an open act of Washington distancing itself from this war. Now, by no means do I think they're looking for an off ramp. I could see how one may have thought that was a possibility, say over the course of the past month, but I do think the direction we're going, especially with the rhetoric out of Europe, particularly Germany and Poland, I think there are two key countries in this, that Washington wishes to have the public appearance of having distanced itself from this war while putting the burden on Europe, and of course that could also mean, and it most likely means, that countries like Germany and Poland are going to serve as third party channels because while they do have quite a bit of their own military equipment and funds to give over to Ukraine, the main engine of the Ukrainian war effort, of course, is the United States. But if they can funnel this through other European countries, it becomes a lot more
Yes.
deniable. It becomes a lot less sensational. When
Exactly where I was going. Yep. Yep. Go ahead.
whereas instead of an American aid package to Ukraine, you see a German aid package to Ukraine that originally came from America, but those details have been erased as part of the transaction.
Hmm. Yeah, I could very well see something like funding for Ukrainian refugees in Germany.
And homosexual Russians as well. As I'm sure you all saw the headlines for that.
Yes. Yes.
Man, that's gonna be wild when the Banderite diaspora get put in the same apartment block as the gay Russian exiles. That's not gonna end well. Uh, yeah, they can hang out with all the Turkish nationalists living in Berlin too. It's gonna be one big diverse party. Uh, but but yeah, in all seriousness, I agree with you that of course you're going to see the push for, of course, more Ukrainian refugees. You're going to see a very subtle doubling down on this war effort. As contradictory as it sounds, it's going to be a very subtle doubling down because you can see the panic out of Kiev, and I do want to get into some of Aristovich's statements because he gave a very risky interview, I'll say. I'll be surprised if the SBU doesn't come after him for this one, or some other state apparatus of Ukraine doesn't come after him for this one, because he touched some ground that really shouldn't have been touched. But just in general on the battlefield, I think you covered it very well, as usual. That as confidence wavers both at home and abroad for the Ukrainian war effort, you see that gradual Russian push, especially now as more of their war machine is activated. They have more troops, more resources to really press this. The Ukrainians have exhausted themselves after, what, 5, 6 months of so-called summer counteroffensive that lasted well into November before they declared it a stalemate. They failed to even
Yes.
break through the first line defense. Once again, covering old ground here, but point being is the Ukrainians absolutely exhaust themselves on this one in a million chance that they're going to cut through the quote unquote land bridge to the Sea of Azov and take Crimea by the end of the year. Now, I don't think that was the actual plan. A lot of that's rhetoric, a lot of that's propaganda, a lot of that is to rally the troops in a quite literal sense. But I do think that they expected to make headway into the southern front and try to disrupt the Russian lines there, and at least cut off one avenue of supplying Crimea while keeping pressure on the Kerch Bridge. If I'm talking about what was seriously going on in the war room in Kiev and, of course, in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, London, etc., I do think that was probably the actual plan for the counteroffensive, and beyond any of the propaganda, beyond the so-called trailer that they put out for it. Once again, a lot of that is bluster, a lot of that is PR stuff. Now, you could say it's stupid. I would say it's stupid, but ultimately a lot of that's PR and not what's actually going on. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I
go
sent
ahead.
you one more image of Bakhmut where you kind of get a better overall picture of what I was talking about. These were the gains since the show last week that we did. So you can see that the Russians have increased their buffer zone across the, let's say, the central western side of Bakhmut. They've made some gains north of Soledar, which is the town north of Bakhmut as well. Smaller, but they're pushing in that area as well. Yeah, and as just to add to what you've mentioned, there was a Washington Post article that came out a few weeks ago, stating that there were 8 tabletop. I guess when they say tabletop, they mean large maps, units, depictions of units with I don't know, some kind of little objects to represent brigades and battalions.
Oh, absolutely.
You
And
know,
they're
it's
just a side note for that. Whenever, and you have to imagine what the ones behind closed doors look like. These are the ones that they publicize. I don't know if any of you remember. I think it was March 2023 where they did a live hypothetical war game with China, where I think they had NBC, CNN, one of these
yeah,
hack news outlets in there, and it's just these military officers and these politicians saying the most outlandish things about, well, oh, China could do this, they want to take Taiwan, but and now I'm sure when you get into the deeper levels of the Pentagon, it's a bit more serious, but the stuff they publicize, it really does make me question the grand strategy of the American empire. I mean, look, you can have an enemy, you can say that they're evil, you can say that they're malicious, but calling them stupid is another thing. I'm growing more to the conclusion that while I wouldn't say the structure top down is stupid, there's a lot more stupidity in the system than I think any of us have even realized.
yeah,
But
and I think
please go on.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's that. If people want to visualize, that's a good example. I imagine this would have been in some ways simpler, uh, le, you know, but also more complex. The conversation that would have taken place, the 8 times that NATO generals met with Ukrainian generals and gave them the outline for how they were going to conduct their spring, summer, and fall offensive. So there's no question of just how much the U.S. is involved in this war. Speaking of involvement, maybe I mentioned it last time, but there was video evidence of another HIMARS launcher that was destroyed. It's only, I think, the second or third one of this year, so much fewer than according to Russian claims than the year before. I don't know about all those Russian claims from 2022, to be perfectly honest with you. Um, and there is kind of a debate about how effective the electronic warfare by the Russians. Not not in the Western media, but some of the guys on Telegram were claiming, and we don't know if these people are experts or not, but they're claiming that some of these warning systems are actually, they might be effective to a degree, but they're not as effective as you might think. I don't know. If you compare that with obviously they're writing these articles because they want to send more arms to Ukraine, but at the same time they want to tell you that they are fighting a Russia that has adapted to U.S. and European military material of the highest order, because it is the best that they've got. So obviously, the truth is somewhere in the middle, as I would gather. Um, yeah, the other bit of news, of course, is the Russians have increased There's strikes. I know the Ukrainians are claiming that they're shooting down half all the Kinjals. I don't believe that whatsoever. Um, there were strikes on Kiev. A Turkish source, Turkey's pretty good about this stuff. Um, once in a while they release information that bears itself to be true, and this is no less. This was no less the case when we talked about the peace talks and the talks between Putin and Bennett when he was prime minister of Israel, not to kill Zelensky. So I do have some faith in the Turkish intelligence, and so what they claimed was several Patriot batteries have been destroyed in the recent strikes by Kinjals, including two strikes that happened in the airport that the Russians have frequently attacked, which is in the west side of Ukraine. It's west of Kiev. So apparently, two Kinjals hit there, another one hit in Kiev. And there's speculation about maybe there were Patriot systems at this airport of Starokonstantinov, which is a town just slightly south, but much more west of Ukraine, kind of like almost halfway between, let's say, Kiev and Lvov. So, um, yeah, I mean, the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the Russians have stepped up the strikes with drones and various types of missiles, hypersonic and supersonic. And, I don't know, some missiles to me appear like they break the sound barrier, but they're not much faster than that. They're, of course, using decoys. Some of the missiles have no warheads at all. They're there basically to light up where the Ukrainian air defense is, because apparently they still have some. Um, anyways, I guess the other bit of news from the extreme west of Ukraine is that disgruntled member of the political party, Zelensky's political party, Servant of the People, uh, who threw those grenades into the crowd.
Oh yes,
He did.
and there was actually an interesting piece of commentary from Arstovich I was going to share on
Mm-hmm.
the show about that. And after
Yeah, do.
yeah, after we get through that, I don't know if you saw the article that the Institute for the Study of War put out, but I was gonna go over that if you want to pick through that, but it shouldn't take too long. But here's the statement that Arstovich put out that I thought was pretty interesting. This isn't his even more controversial one, which I'll get into in a minute here. When I said 6 months ago in an interview with Dmitry Gordon that mandatory psychological rehabilitation is necessary for the entirety of society, especially for soldiers of the Defense Force, I remember all sorts of wonderful people in mass stood in our favorite national pose, offended. So how? What is the characteristic that he is a deputy from the ruling Servant of the People Party? Might I add that Telegram's translation feature does an amazing look. I don't speak Ukrainian, I don't speak Russian, but it does an amazing job, at least what I imagine, is capturing the original tone of what it was written in. But I digress. So, what is the characteristic that he is a deputy from the Servant of the People Party, Zelensky's party? According to information that requires clarification, he served in the 128th Brigade, received disability, and sought social assistance, including for himself. They didn't want to listen to him. He found a way to attract their attention. Let me remind you, at the end of the war, thousands of mortally exhausted drone operators will return. You can't escape an FPV, even in a car. This is the price for the loss of meaning and dignity. It will get worse and worse again until meaning is found and we regained our dignity. So I thought that was a pretty interesting statement by the former advisor to the president regarding what some of these men have been through and what they will do as a result of that. And I think every society that has had a major war like this has had problems with people who have been naturally scarred by those wars because of the profound. I mean, look at the end of World War One going into World War Two. I mean, I know this is getting into very basic history territory. I don't mean that in the sense of like simple. I mean that in the sense of watering down a lot of the essential elements. I mean, but mind you, when you had Mussolini and Hitler respectively come to power in Italy and Germany, and you could even extend this to the Russian Civil War and the establishment of the Soviet Union. It was these battle-hardened men who brought about these regimes because of a myriad of factors, of course, unique to each country. But point being is, you had a massive amount of social instability because there were masses of young men mobilized, sent into this war, who came back with many of them all sorts of issues, and this was the end result. And look, you can talk about the results of those through regimes, and there's plenty of discussion to be had about that. But point being is, at least in the short term, if not through the long term, it creates a massive amount of social instability if you cannot properly provide and help these people after the course of the war is over.
Hmm.
And I just, yeah, go ahead.
Pardon me. Yeah, Aristovich has said some. I can't remember now off the top of my head, but he did say something else this week. I can't remember, but one of the two things that stood out was the one that you brought up. Um, he said something along the lines of, "Oh, that's right." Putin had his yearly meeting. These things run longer than our shows,
Oh, it's
and
meticulous.
yes, and he noted that the stage had the colors of blue and yellow, just like the Ukrainian flag. And he said that if Zelensky had done a similar show, which he wouldn't, he pointed out, and there were the tricolors of the Russian flag, red, white, and blue, there would be an uproar. The default reaction would have been, as he said, outrage, right? And he said that he's taking all kinds of questions, something that Zelensky would not, because this, and it's not like it was all for main media conglomerates from around the globe. Everyday Russians phoned in, and they asked very simple things. Why are the price of eggs so high where I am, and they're not like the same over there? Or, yeah, we've got a lot of gas, but why is it so expensive here as opposed to Moscow, et cetera, et cetera, right? So he noted that, and he said, meanwhile, the Ukrainians are still in the business of just calling them orcs and pigs. And he said, they don't call us that. And who looks strong right now, us or them? Obviously, a rhetorical question, but I thought that was interesting too. Now, of course, everybody knows he has said. I mean, I think these are salient things that he has said, and some of them might even prove to be prescient. But I would, I just love some of the crazier things that came out of his mouth this year. At the beginning, to save Ukraine, I lied about its about its potential. I'm now telling you the truth to also save Ukraine. So, like, he lied to save you, and then he's now telling you the truth also to save you. He discredits himself, but I think if you put that aside for a moment, funny as it is, there's no question he's on the money here, right? He's had this criticism of Ukrainian society, I must say, throughout. Even in 2022, he's had you know criticisms that almost had the same order of words um, used to describe some of the pitfalls of the psychology of Ukrainians with regards to Russia. I think
Yeah,
he is right about these things.
I do think if you put, once again, the more clownish elements aside, now I think it is something we have to say, just as a disclaimer, there will never be a bigger clown in Kiev than Zelensky, just naturally.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
The court jester has taken the throne, as it were.
Yeah.
But it, Aristovich does have his moments of very sober analysis, and I would say if I had to describe the man, he has very high peaks and very low valleys, but the very low valleys provide a wealth of entertainment. I will add that much. But
Mhm.
here he was conducting an interview. I just want to read the subtitles here of what he was saying.
Yeah.
I'm not going to play the audio because once again, most of you I gauge would not be able to understand it, so I'm not going to waste the time with trying to set that up. But just beginning from here, this is not even an inability to produce shells or build structures. It's inability to answer the question, why are we fighting? And then he goes on,
Mm.
uh, and because this is not answered in discussion programs or on the internet, this is answered in practice when 4.5 million men are hiding from being registered with the military, i.e., half the adult population. In gyms, they write instructions how to escape from the military. This is a death sentence for this country. Nobody knows why to fight for an independent Ukraine. That's the problem. If we would answer these questions, all the questions we resolved along the claim, and when we instead answer why they say Russian soldiers were captured, this is such a striking discrepancy with the real issues and the real actions. There's no other word. This is a sentence. And even the extraordinary measure that I spoke about will not have an effect without an answer to the question, why is an independent Ukraine needed? It's considered valuable by those men who say, why would I hide in a technical room or not go to a sports club? Can you imagine what is now being written into the consciousness of Ukrainian families, into their collective unconsciousness? A wife whose husband is hiding at home, a wife who goes to the store to buy bread, will she respect him much?
Yes.
A
Yeah, I thought
draft
that was
dodger
interesting.
who hides under the sofa, and this is the case in many Ukrainian families. And what about the children who watch their dad and mom carry heavy bags of groceries? Dad hide and mom carry heavy bags of groceries. Why do they? What do they write down in their subconsciouses? What will they have in the subcortex of the subconscious? How they live? How will they vote? Even if an independent Ukraine miraculously remains, his words, not mine.
Hmm.
What is now being recorded in the collective memory of the people? The dad who was willing to hide under the sofa, mom who carried the bags and hid dad under her skirt so that he would not go into the army. Who is to blame for this? Who arranged all of this? We. No, not even specific politicians. For 32 years, we lies, were stupid, humiliated others, humiliated ourselves, tried to change the master, and we will now eat with a spoon what we did for 32 years. If we do not delve into the further history and do not reach the brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
thought that was
Yeah,
interesting.
interesting
I
choice of
saw that.
words. We will record one program about this. So that was just an excerpt of the interview. Quality of the subtitles, like once again, cannot attest to, as I am not either Ukrainian or Russian speaker. So just take those as it were. But yeah, I thought that that was an interesting point that I have not heard anyone on any side of this war raise, and that is the question of, well, why isn't independent Ukraine necessary? And once again, it goes back to some of the rhetoric we were talking about, where actually even he brought up that the main rhetoric bolstering this war, at least inside Ukraine, is the Moscow pig dogs who are Asiatics and not true Europeans. Like just that kind of very canned rhetoric, and of course what's coming from the outside world, which is liberal democracy versus retrograde dictatorship, etc., etc. But he ultimately brings up a point. Why is it in an independent nation? Why is it that you have millions upon millions of men who are hiding out, who are at being forced to neglect the responsibilities of their families to avoid conscription, instead of going to the front lines? What makes them not want to serve their nation? And when you get to that point, when you get to the point in war where you have to ask that question, I think his words on the ask on saying, "If an independent Ukraine miraculously survives," are very warranted. And I mean, at this point, of course, the propaganda mill will say Arstovich is a Russian plant. He's been compromised by Putler or whatever. But honestly, I think we're looking at a man who naturally supported Ukraine in the war effort, being probably as close to the center of power as you can be, uh, while avoiding the office of president. And I think we're just looking at a man who is just extremely pessimistic about the fate of his country and is starting to ask these fundamental questions of, well, why did this happen? How did we let it get to this point? And I don't really think that anyone can honestly really refute or give a sufficient answer to anything he's saying.
My theory with Arestovich is that he helped this war get started so he could eventually become president of Ukraine.
You know,
No, I
it's not
still
unheard
remember
of.
that. No, I still remember that video he did at the end of 2019. He's being interviewed by this young woman, and you know how he's so supremely confident, right?
Oh,
Like
of course.
absolutely narcissistic levels of confidence, and he says, um, "There will be a war, and it will happen in the next 2 years. It could be 2020, it could be 2021, 2022, but war is inevitable." I found that striking. That he would be so blatant about it. Of course, he was part of Zelensky's team at the time. Um, you know, um, no, I think he's a political animal, and he's very good at maneuvering, knowing what to say when. The thing I don't know is, where is he? Like, I don't know if he's in Ukraine or not. Because
He's in Moscow.
yes, that's right. One of he was one of Zhirinovsky's men, a deep cell,
It's true.
there to yes. um, no, there is that interview that Zhirinovsky had. He was on some kind of a talk show. He was part of a panel. You look in the crowd, and it's filled with like uh, notables from like just before the Ukrainian Maidan happened. Uh, Lyshek is there, that leader of the Svoboda party. I don't mean Yarosh, different guy. Um, and of course, Arestovich was in the crowd too. Anyways, but enough of that. I just
Well,
he's very astute. Like, he's right about this. I think he's kind of like an antenna of where things are going. Um,
honestly,
of course,
his
he got on the anti-Zelensky bandwagon. In some ways, he led it. But you see guys like the Klitschko brothers, who are also anti Zelensky. We should mention. I forgot to mention when Gio was on, that Zelensky went to Kherson, Zaporozhye, and then in the northern part of Donbass, or could have, I think, actually Kupiansk. He's now giving orders superseding Zaluzhny. So he's doing more than just morale work. He's trying to keep the generals basically on his side, essentially, I would say, threatening them, and trying to make Zaluzhny irrelevant, because, of course, Zelensky a few weeks ago stated that anybody in Ukraine, which is a free country, can run for president, but a general shouldn't, because it's not his expertise. He's not a politician. He's a military man, and if he wants to, then he should leave the military. So, um, I mean, there are signs of the regime is cracking. I think I think that's evident that 2023 isn't over yet. It soon will be, and we'll just have to see what the winter brings.
Now, before we get into the Institute for Study of War article, I do want to go over Zelensky's Christmas list that he presented to Congress during his most recent visit, and that included the no specific numbers. They just want this equipment in unspecified numbers: F-16s, F-18s, AH-64 Apache helicopters, UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, C-130 Super Hercules transport aircrafts, C-17 Globemaster III transports, THAAD air defense systems, M1 Abrams tanks, attack missiles, and the 9 drones. So that is the equipment. Once again, we're talking about standard equipment that is currently used by the United States, because what we've seen so far with the American aid, it has been last generation equipment that we've been. Now, I would say, with the exception of the F-16, which is, I guess, in some circumstances you can consider last generation equipment. This is all,
It's a very
yeah.
good
This is,
performing jet. I mean,
yeah. Oh,
many modern air
absolutely.
forces still use it.
F-16 is a beautiful aircraft, and
It is.
frankly, I would take it over the F-35 if I had to fly one. But if I had to pick between
Hmm.
the two, honestly, with what I know about it, but aviation autism aside, I'll I'll put that on the shelf for now. As much as I'd love to go down that rabbit hole, you got to be careful when you bring up those things. But that aside, F-16, once again, beautiful fighter, beautiful aircraft. Still last generation compared to a lot of what's out there now. But we're talking about the F-18, which in its multiple variations is the current bulk of the American air fleet, at least for now. They're trying to phase it out for the F-35. A mistake in my opinion, but I digress. But we're looking at, once again, military equipment that is up to date, current generation military equipment versus a lot of the last generation stuff that we would have sent in the beginning stages of the war. And these are the demands of the Ukrainians now. While on a back footing, they want the more advanced equipment. They want us to risk more. They want the American Empire, Washington, to risk more for a project that has already proved to have disappointing returns, to say the least.
Hmm.
And I really don't see how they're going to get this. Now, as we were discussing earlier, the future of funding the war in Ukraine, because it I could be proven wrong, but for now it seems like the collective West has no interest in disengaging from this war. It's going to be a public disassociation in the United States, but backdoor channels, particularly the Europeans, that are still supporting them. That is what I think is what we're going to see throughout 2024. Put more pressure on Europe, make it more of a European central conflict, while Biden comes in, while he tries to secure re-election, or whoever Biden's replacement is in the DNC. Pretty much anything it takes to get Trump out. And even though I do think there are certain factions within the elite, particularly more ardent Zionists, who would prefer Trump given the current global climate, they would prefer somebody like that who would be very conciliatory towards Israel, even more so than most American leaders. But once again, we'll get into the question of Israel and the situation there in a little bit after we get through this article from the Institute of Study of War. But as the war sours, of course, Zelensky becomes more brazen. He becomes more desperate. He feels that he has to make these more demanding calls because interest is being divided, attention is being divided, resources are being divided, and he has to come here and make his bid, especially as we enter into a new year. As I know that when it comes to many of the fiscal matters, we're talking October's around the time they reset. But once again, we're going into a new year. A lot of administrative goals in the U.S. are going to be reset, reevaluated, as they are every year. Just typical government function. And Zelensky wants to make sure that Ukraine is at the top of that priority list. Whereas, say in 2023, even going back to 2022 before the war proper broke out, there was a solid front of defense, but solid front of defense and support, I should say. But
Hmm.
as we creep into the second year of this war, confidence has understandably wavered, and priorities have also seemed to have shifted, especially with the potential for upheaval in this upcoming November election. But with that being said, if you have any thoughts on that, certainly. If not, we'll go
Yeah,
ahead and get into this article. But go ahead.
yeah. Just a few things. I mean, when Zelensky was in Washington, I don't know if this is part of the last tranche of aid to Ukraine, but I seem to remember that Biden gave him a check for 200 million. I know that's pittance, but even according to his own White House staff, there is only 1% of the $106 billion left. So I would assume it's part of this last 1%. Um, the other thing is let's suppose that now Chuck Schumer said that they're not going to go for summer of sorry for Christmas holidays, and that they plan to meet on Monday, and if it takes the whole week in order to give Ukraine an aid package. Schumer is like obsessed with this. Uh, no surprise. Um, but I could see a strategy where, let's say, the Americans say, well, and under what's his name, Johnstone, or is it Johnson? The new
Yeah, Mike Johnson, new speaker.
Mike. Yeah, so the new speaker, Mike Johnson. It could be let's say the Republicans hold fast. Might not happen. We'll know in 48 hours or 72 hours. But let's say they hold fast and the funding doesn't come about, right? Obviously, they lose nothing. Obviously, this is a good ploy for them for reelection, right? Even if it's only Blumph next year, it's the Republicans win. It's a win for them, even if they have to pinch their nose. Um, what that will set up for the Democrats is to say that if anything goes bad, the Republicans will be to blame. Of course, they're calling the Republicans, you know, Putin stooges. The GOP is Russian red is a hashtag that I've seen on Twitter. This kills me because, like, let's see, they were there at the beginning, giving aid in 1 year that took 10 years for Afghanistan. Okay, just in the first 6 7 months of 2022. All right. But now suddenly they've changed their mind. Now they're suddenly working for Putin. Like these, it's always emotional. It's always preposterous. But what that'll do for the Democrats is, if things go bad, right, the Republicans will be to blame. If things don't go bad, let's say the Europeans give most of the funding. Um, then the Republicans will be condemned. Ukraine is still holding fast, so that's a win-win situation for them. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how much of this depends on because at some level, I know that the politicians want the American public to really, really care about the war in Ukraine, but they deep down inside know that the border issue is the biggest issue, and Israel is not even as big as the border issue.
Oh yeah, they're going into 24. They gotta hammer the immigration question, especially with the very contentious situation that has developed in the past, I would say 18 months in the
Yeah,
southwestern U.S. in particular. We're talking Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. That hot spot there, where not only are you getting people from Mexico, from other Central American countries, but you're getting people from all over the world, Africans, Asian, Indians, who are coming to Mexico in convoys and crossing over the border. So
yeah,
that's a situation that even the swamp creatures, the regime
mm,
supporters, are growing nervous about, because as much as they would love to take the entire world, they're confronted with a similar situation, say, that the Europeans were in 2019, 2020, where they realized that this is just too much system overload. We're overplaying our hand. We're going to hand everything over to our opponents. Now, in reality, as we know, handing it over to their opponents just means uh, a slower pace of the same thing. But once again,
mm-hmm,
a lot of the regime supporters don't understand that, and a lot of the regime operators do understand that, but prefer not to wait
mm,
that long and prefer not to give any sort of legitimacy to their opponents, to the say the people that Trump claimed to speak for example. But they're looking at the situation. They realize that this is a situation that needs to be curtailed. And I mean, I am actually expecting funding for the border because of that exact reason. They need to
yeah,
quell the situation. Biden needs to, or once again, whoever's replacement is, needs to pacify the situation, needs to, even if the crisis isn't solved, take that rhetorical arrow out of the quiver of the Republicans, out of the quiver of Trump, where Trump can get up on stage and talk about his immigration platform, which case I think most people who listen to this program would probably agree with, and you might actually say it's too moderate. But then the opposing operatives, the Democratic operative, can say, "Well, look what Biden did on immigration. He took care of that. Trump's just fear mongering." Blah blah blah. Once again, the same way electoral politics are always
Right, right,
played.
right. Yes, and it's so ironic because this wouldn't even have been a political ping pong ball had Trump been allowed to the meager 5 billion that he was asking for back in 2017 and 18, right? Um, but just so as I don't digress, you have to think this bill they've been trying to pass in Congress for this supplemental aid for Ukraine that also includes aid to Israel, the border, and even Taiwan. They haven't redrafted it. They haven't changed anything, right? It's not passing, and yet they're not willing to alter anything, right? Um, there's some kind of political brinkmanship here, right? They like I would say that the Democrats are interested in making the Republicans look weak, uh, and that they will eventually succumb.
And
They
you've
will
also
eventually
had
succumb.
the House responding kind on top of all of this. We're over the Hunter Biden nonsense, and I heard somebody once say, I wish I remember who it was to give credit, just to because I think it best summarized the Hunter Biden situation that Hunter Biden is a MAGA boomer's version of Christian. but
Mm.
but with that aside, because I think it's probably the best terms I've ever heard him described in. Now, when we could do we could do a whole 6 hour show on Hunter Biden's new coke binges, but we're not going to
Yeah.
because I'm not going to subject our lovely audience to that. But getting back to the point, that tangent aside, you've had the House open up an investigation over the Hunter Biden nonsense and its connection to Biden. There were some leaked emails, something about 20% to Hunter, to so and so, blah blah blah, and 10% for the quote unquote big guy, that being Joe Biden, of course. Who else would it be? So you do have the House. It does seem that they're trying to escalate, especially in an election year, especially with the legal pressure being put on Trump now, trying to respond in kind by having a potential impeachment crisis on Biden's shoulders. Now, of course, I don't think any of them expect to remove him from office, especially with the Senate still being controlled by the Democrats, and that's not even to mention that you need the 2/3 to even get that through. Once again, I don't think they're trying to remove Biden, but it's to create that pressure. It's to bog down the system. It's to uh, decrease legitimacy. And while normally I would praise it as the Republicans actually showing some teeth and representing their base's interests, we all know why this is happening. We all know why the Republicans are allowed to be politically aggressive right now. Because Israel's on the line. To a lesser extent, Ukraine's on the line.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
the American empire itself is falling to a crisis of legitimacy. So that's why the big, strong, tough, patriotic conservatives are allowed to show their teeth. Not for
Yes.
the actual American nation, not for the American ethnos, but for the American empire and
Mhm.
the values that go against everything they at least claim to support. But once again, I think everyone here understands that, but I do think that pen needs to be put to paper every once in a while on those kind of things.
Yeah. I completely agree. But it is going to be like I said. They I think they want to finish off the year looking strong. That they resisted Biden. In 2020, I know the matters were more complicated. There were Republicans, obviously, that didn't want Trump to win. His presidency was always plagued by this. But I would say I think 2024 is different. One of the lessons, of course, is not that not that Republicans aren't losers, but um, maybe they. One thing that can be said about Trump is like even with Trump out of the presidential Oval Office, whatever MAGA is, like it persists, and even someone like what DeSantis is like a fake attempt, right? Um, it I think even
Or,
if
or
they
like
decide to
Vivek, for that matter. it's
Yes.
it's all the same that Trump has fundamentally opened a floodgate that cannot be closed. And in the few cases that you get these quote unquote Republicans, quote unquote conservatives, who try to go back to the status quo, say like a Chris Christie or Nikki Haley, they just get laughed off the stage. Nobody cares. In which case, I mean, yeah, we can talk about Vivek. Sure, he said some interesting things now. I think there's some ulterior motives to that, certainly. But Trump or DeSantis is going to be the one who gets the nomination. And of course, Trump is the one uh, who took Finkelstein's deal, as you recall. And DeSantis is trying to pose himself as the successor to that while challenging the uh, quote unquote
Right,
founder
right.
of it. So once again, it gets bogged down in electoral politics, as it were. But getting back to your point, but yes, fundamentally, a bridge has been crossed. The Overton window is shifted, as everyone loves to say, where some things
Yes.
just they cannot go back on.
Yes, I think that's what's clear right now for them. They I think after 4 years they feel that they have found a way to co-opt it. Even if DeSantis is not successful, I don't believe he's going to be successful at all. He has no charisma. He doesn't stand a chance with against Trump.
I mean, but trust me,
Uh,
with the way Trump ran his last administration, DeSantis will most likely be in the cabinet, at least, if not running mate. Now, some people may say that's a bit drastic,
right,
but
right. I see what
I
you mean.
guarantee you DeSantis will have some sort of position in the Trump administration if Trump gets
Mm,
reelected.
mm. A good point. So it's a question of them looking strong, right? Because in 2020, uh, nobody nobody doubted the Biden was senile, um, and yet he got elected, right? It's in their interest to make the Democrats look weak. He's incredibly unpopular. Um, you know, um, it's up to them not to let not let a defeat get snatched out of the jaws of victory. Like if they're smart, if they're not the total losers that we think they are, I could see that. You know.
Absolutely. And I would say conversely on the Democratic side, and some may say this stretch, but I do think that we are seeing movement towards such where there's been plenty of talk about quote unquote putting the woke away or putting the woke on the shelf, etc. Trying to tone down the more extreme rhetoric before the
Hmm.
election, and especially now that Israel and by extension the American empire is in a very uncomfortable position. They're trying to extend an olive branch back to the white man, so to speak, back to
Yes.
the middle American. And I mean, look at what they did with the vaccination policy in the military, where they're sending these letters saying, "Please, please, please rejoin. Our recruitment numbers are down. We need you. You're the backbone. You're the guys who are actually going to fight this war if we're going to
Will
go into
you
Iran
die?
or Ukraine." It's like, please, we need you back. We beg you. And you know what? To the credit of a lot of those guys, a lot of those guys tore up those letters and threw them away. And you know what?
Yep.
Uh, More power to them. I'm glad that they've broken free of servitude to these people who have nothing but contempt for them. So I'll
Please,
say,
guys, please come back.
but with that, I do think as much as you're getting the reinvigoration of the Republicans, the right on the put away the woke issue, I think that the Democrats, despite the fact that they do want the now, of course, they're going to get the college campus activist vote. That's scary. Even with all the Palestine nonsense, even with all the Israel nonsense, when they see that Trump is running again, they're going to run to the shelter the Democratic Party and say, please, please protect us from this evil fascist. We don't care about what you did with Israel. We don't care what you did about the Palestinians. We don't care about all your failed promises. Please protect us from fascism or white supremacy or whatever the buzzword they choose for that election is. We've seen this time and time again. Every election cycle, this happens every time. But point being is, in order to get the guy in Wisconsin who kind of likes Trump but looks at him like, oh, what did he really deliver? Or who maybe does have more Democratic sympathies because of his blue collar background, but has been put on the side of the Republicans for a myriad of reasons over the past few election cycles. I do think that with that the Democrats, while it might not seem like it now, as I think we get close to election, are trying to take a much more culturally and socially moderate position than say they would have in 2020, especially in 2016 with Hillary, where in 2016, it was really at the height of that, where it was really campaigning on the social liberalism. Hillary's a woman; she's going to appoint an all-black cabinet, and America's going to be great. We have gay marriage now. Once again, I'm
Yeah.
sure you remember all remember the Hillary 2016 campaign.
Yes.
It was basically that we're going to have the black trans women cabinet led by the glorious Hillary Clinton. Once again, I will always be eternally thankful to Trump for preventing that, but
Yes,
uh, is
but we have Jill Biden making up for it as much as possible with her gay Christmas celebration.
hey, I will have you know on this program we call her Doctor Jill Biden.
It was, it was, it was literally the most Weimar Republic shit I've ever seen.
More Weimar than Weimar. Okay, but I
Weimar in color.
Weimar with colors. Okay, we're getting off track here. I think it's time to get into that
But I was
it's
gonna.
yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't know. I don't know which direction you want to take it.
I, I
I
I wanted to
just.
go over that article from the Institute of Study of War because I've been putting this off for like
Yeah.
half an hour.
Okay. Just very briefly.
No, go ahead, please.
Um, if the funding doesn't happen, Europe is going to step in. We've seen the rhetoric for the last 2 weeks. There are more articles from the European press, Lithuania, Germany, France, particularly Germany, though, and Sweden and Lithuania, claiming um, be prepared. Like, there was literally an article today from Der Spiegel about be prepared for a war, for a potential for a war. Scholz wants to enact emergency powers, uh, or have the. I guess he's preparing them for the possibility of enacting emergency powers. All of this is happening because the front lines that I spent way too much time on are indicating that there is a crumbling that is happening right
Oh,
now on the
absolutely.
front. And just to add to that, um, the president of the Czech Republic, what's his name, Pavel.
Yeah.
Okay, so apparently there were. This confirms that Czech mercenaries, maybe not. They're fighting on this. Obviously they're fighting for Kiev, but this might be more official than we were led to believe. So there were 553 applicants to go and fight on behalf of Kiev officially. Officially. So these aren't like mercs. Like I mean, they have ideological reasons why they want to fight, but they're technically under the umbrella of mercs. This is an official statement,
Yes, and
right?
keep in mind
It's open.
this comes about a week after you had the head of the Slovak parliament visiting the Czech Republic, where he said, and I quote, "No one
Yeah,
will ever force Slovaks to hate Russia. Weapons from Slovakia will not go to Ukraine, and Soros non-governmental
yeah,
organizations will not rule in
yeah,
Slovakia." So
yeah,
you also have that internal tension there, where
yeah.
you're seeing these dividing lines in Europe now. Of course, most of Europe, at least Europe's governments, will fall down on the side of Ukraine with that. But there is discontent from these small nations that can form a stumbling block. For example, Orban's statements about Ukraine never being that Ukraine will never be admitted in the EU so long as he has a say about it. So it is starting to cause this friction here, and you could potentially see if you have more opportunistic politicians or depending on the election cycles in the next few years in more major countries. While I doubt that Europe is going to throw everything away and abandon Ukraine entirely, it can certainly
Hmm.
stifle support for Ukraine,
Hmm.
which I think if the Russians if they want to play puppet masters, of course, as we all know that they're just masters at rigging elections. Forget Trump Biden 24. Focus on these elections in Europe if you want to sow discontent. But I digress.
Yeah, so about 154 of these people have been granted permission, but there was 553 altogether. Now of course Czech mercs have been killed there. I mentioned on the last show an American Vargas and a guy named Brad Stratford, an officer, a former officer of the Canadian Armed Forces, was killed in Bakhmut, and that was about a week after a Canadian First Nations, as we call them, from Quebec. His last name escapes me. His first name, I think, was, I don't know, might have been Jordan. It was a very, like, it was not a very typically French Canadian name, but he was like he was I mean, he's not like French Canadian as in from France. He's a native
Yeah.
from Quebec. Anyhow, he was killed a week before former Officer Stratford, was killed. But yeah, I think we're going to see more of this kind of rhetoric. Europe is going to be left holding the ball, but that gets at a primary problem, right? Uh, Orban mentioned that 71% of European citizens want this war to end immediately. Immediately. End the war and engage in peace talks. Just stop the war. Freeze it right now. Um, but I would say this is the crux of the problem for the Europeans. If we accept the European elites deep down inside want like American globalists to take care of them, right? Then it's kind of redundant to let the Europeans foot the bill, the primary portion of it. They have the money. Don't get me wrong. The EU has $100 billion that they could give to Ukraine. Hungary, to some extent, is an obstacle to that, right? And we're not even talking about the frozen assets, which have been brought up yet again. But the fact of the matter is, like, the whole point of Europe being subservient to America is that it has benefits. And to me, this doesn't have benefits.
Oh no, no. And I also wanted to bring up that even since the start of this war, and we're about 22 months in this war, if I have my math right, that since day one, since February 24th, 2022, Europe has still been importing nuclear fuel from Russia. Despite the oil sanctions, despite the gas sanctions, despite all the other sanctions, nuclear fuel has been the one consistent exception to the sanctions packages. Because
Mm-hmm.
they know that's their lifeline. They tout the energy independence of France. If only Germany kept their nuclear plants online, they wouldn't have this issue. It's not energy independence. I'm not saying this to even knock nuclear power as a concept. I'd say I'm, I would say I'm generally in favor, but I don't know enough to make a very informed statement on it. But point being is, it's not the path to energy independence that everyone thinks it is. They need that uranium from Russia, from Kazakhstan, from West Africa. And keep in mind, West Africa has fallen into complete disarray ever since the end of the summer. I mean, there's other places like Canada, Australia,
Mm-hmm.
to an extent, the United States. But point being is, the Europeans are just reliant on energy imports with nuclear power as they are on oil and natural gas. Really, the only resource that I think the Europeans collectively among themselves can really muster is coal. And that's probably the worst environmentally speaking and the worst in terms of efficiency that you can do. So, for all intents and purposes, the Europeans are still energy dependent. And that's another area where the benefits of the American empire are failing to deliver. And really, if we have any cartoonists out in the audience, I would love to show a picture of this on the show. Uh, I need Joe Biden squeezing Europe on a juicer.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I need. And I don't know, think of some creative label like War Machine or War Funds, or maybe the juice comes out as like dollars, as like money. But that's what it feels like is happening right now. You have the American Empire trying to squeeze every drop of juice it can out of the Europeans right now. In terms of the relationship, it has come to that point in the empire where they start to call on the vassals to do the duty that they. Well, I don't even want to put it that way because it makes the relationship sound a lot more benevolent than it actually is. But have called upon the
Mm-hmm.
vassals to take up arms on behalf of their master, as one would say would be implicitly expected like a time like this, because in the good times and the prosperous time, of course, the wealth is leaving the center of the empire and going to the vassals in order to keep them happy, in order to keep them supported, with the understanding that one day when there is the call to arms, they will answer. And the call to arms has come. The Europeans have answered, but it's been below the expectations of, say, what Washington would have wanted, especially with what they're capable of doing. Because the Europeans have their own interests. They have their own crises to manage. Because if they did send 100 billion to Ukraine in order to
Mm-hmm.
sustain this war effort, What would that say for the administrative functions of Europe? What would that say for the social safety nets of Europe? What would that say for the basic infrastructure of Europe? I'm sure the results would not be pleasant
Yeah,
for anyone.
yeah. I mean, I would say at that point, you can begin to speculate what the various polities within the EU will do, right? Because they're moving towards impoverishment. Like it's one thing for Europe to become dependent on America, which suits America, which stops Europe from being integrated with Eurasia. Um, but it's quite another if their quality of life diminishes. It has diminished, let's say, particularly in Britain, but also in Germany, France, the Baltic states. All of them have noted that
Mind you, the economic
depreciation.
powerhouses have seen a
Yeah,
decrease in the standard of living. We're talking about the
yeah,
countries that in the 2000s progressives would have touted that we should emulate, such as
hmm,
Germany, UK, Sweden, France. Let's emulate their social policies. Let's emulate their social safety nets. But we're looking at these nations fall into decline, and the duplicitous bastards, the progressives, and now look, of course, conservatives have always had their Euro bashing, in which case
yeah,
while I do roll my eyes at it, it comes from a, let's just say, much more understandable place of the fact that they actually view themselves as Americans and have a bit of a triumphalist view, which, and look, you can say what you will about that, but that's a much more natural thing. But I'm talking about these duplicitous progressive bastards who 20 years ago will praise the Europeans for leading the way in progress, and then turn around after the empire that they're fanatically loyal to, whether they admit it or not, has absolutely decimated the standard of living in Europe, and wag their fingers at them and say, well, this is because you voted in center right governments and have taken a slightly more hawkish stance on immigration. I mean, these people are disgusting. I don't think anything else really needs to be said about this. But mind you, these are a lot of people who are movers and shakers. These are journalists. These are quote unquote public opinion leaders who will get on here. At 20 years ago, you can very easily find their statements them praising Sweden, praising Germany, praising the UK, whatever, who now consistently deride them for what has been done
right.
to them. And look, I'm not saying the Europeans are completely free of responsibility, especially in the case of their leadership. Many of them were willing participants, and a lot of Europeans, once again, did fall into that rhetorical trap of we're better Americans than the Americans themselves. Sure, uh, the CIA can blow up our most vital infrastructure, but America better have trans rights or else we're going to be mad. So some of the stuff we talked about last show.
Yeah,
So once again, I'm not
I
saying
mean
that
they're
they're.
lackeys.
Oh,
You just have
absolutely.
to look at. You just have to look at if they attended the Aspen Institute. Like Baerbock. Remember Baerbock in May 2021? We brought that up on the show. Um, Shortly before Merkel left, Baerbock was interviewed on CSIS. Might have been the Atlantic Council, but I seem to remember it was CSIS, by Blinken, no less. And for me, that was a red flag. It's like, okay, they literally have people even more compliant than Merkel. Did Merkel raise a huge fuss when she found out that Obama was eavesdropping and spying on her phone? No, they kept quiet. But even she had more autonomy than Schultz or Annalena
The one
Baerbock's
thing you can give Merkel is that
types.
she had her ear to the ground when it came to Germany's business interests, which
Hmm.
led to a lot more pragmatic governments. Still did irreparable damage in many ways to Germany, especially with her migration policy. But the one redeemable thing that she had was her connection to the business elite of Germany, which bailed them out, both figuratively and literally, out of a number of problems that are now coming back to haunt them. Now, if we go back even further to somebody like, I think it was Schroeder, who was the chancellor in the early 2000s, we're talking about 2003, 2004, even as a social democrat, even as a man of the left, very conciliatory with the Russians, very conciliatory with the idea of that Eurasian bloc, so to speak. Now,
Hmm.
that doesn't mean he was necessarily anti-American. I mean, because German-American relations, especially given just the structure of the post-World War II system, necessitate that they have to be on quote-unquote good terms, or at least have to be subservient to the Americans. But Schroeder, despite being in the position, showed much more autonomy than Merkel or Schloss ever have. Now, once again, Merkel is kind of the transition or transitory figure between those two. I'm not saying that Schroeder was some great like Charles de Gaulle figure. By no means am I saying that.
Yeah.
But point being is, when you looked at him, it did seem like, hey, this man is in charge of the German government and not a complete puppet of Washington.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, you can see generally where I don't want to call it a consensus, but it certainly is a consensus amongst European elites to move greater and greater towards European vassalship. Their complaints against Trump was basically that he was not the figure that they wanted to become vassals to, and um, his request for NATO to be more self-sufficient, meaning the Europeans should pay more of the bill. They resented that. But notice there's no, Schultz resisted, but he always complied eventually. He is a little older. I'm very sure if someone like Annalena Baerbock was in power, she wouldn't have resisted at all. Again, it's who is in charge that matters. It's not that they don't want to give more money toward NATO. They do. Some countries are arguing like everything that we produce should just go to Ukraine. Like, forget about rearming Germany. It should just go to Ukraine, right? And I think
Gunther Fehlinger is the American appointed dictator of all Europe. That's what it's coming to. That's it. You think I'm kidding now? That's what it's coming to.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I would say that ideologically, Trump was the wrong guy, and that's all it came down to. That's why they resisted, because they were afraid that he was going to mess everything up. Um, since it was Biden, they're spending way more than what Trump asked.
Oh no, they can't do enough to please the quote unquote adults in the room. It's a sickening amount of subservience to, and it really does show once again how disingenuous these people are. Where it's anti-Americanism one moment, the moment that it, any sort of rightist tendency arises from across the Atlantic, and then it's complete subservience whenever it's time to get on board for a destructive war effort. And mind you, this isn't even a war that they are directly involved in, at least for the time being. But with all that being said, you want to move on to the
Yep.
article.
Yes, let's do that.
So we have right here military, strategic, and financial implications of a Russian victory, the high price of losing Ukraine. And this is some familiar names: Frederick Kagan, Katerina Stepanko, Mitchell Belcher, Noel Mickelson, and Thomas Bergeron. Dated December 14th, 2023, from the Institute of Study of War. The United States has a much higher stake in Russia's war in Ukraine than most people think. A Russian conquest of all of Ukraine by no means is impossible if the United States cuts off all military assistance and Europe follows suit. Very unlikely prospects there, but I digress. Such an outcome would bring a battered but triumphant Russia an army right up to NATO's border to the Black Sea and to the Arctic Ocean. The Ukrainian military, with Western support, has destroyed nearly 90% of the Russian army that
Oh yeah.
invaded in
Oh yeah.
2022,
Yeah. Oh,
according
for
to
sure.
U.S. intelligence sources. But the Russians have
Yeah.
replaced those manpower losses and are ramping up their industrial base to make good of their material losses at a rate much faster than the pre-war capacity ever permitted. Russia
Yeah.
is taking unprecedented casualties, but is also the gravest threat we've ever faced. We're off to a great start here. A victorious Russian army at the end of the war will mean combat experience considerably larger than the pre 22 Russian land forces. The Russian economy will gradually recover as sanctions will inevitably erode and as Moscow develops ways to circumvent or mitigate the losses that remain. Over time, it will replace its equipment and rebuild its coherence, drawing on a wealth of hard won experience in mechanized warfare It will bring advanced air defense systems that only America's stealth craft, badly needed to deter and confront China, can reliably penetrate. Russia poses a major conventional military threat to NATO for the first time since the 1990s in a time frame set to a considerable extent by how much the Kremlin invests in its military. Since Moscow is committed to an ambitious post-war military expansion program, the U.S. cannot be confident that the time frame will be very long. Notice the sense of urgency that they're trying to build here. They actually
Mm.
say, I don't know how many of you ever had to sit through a corporate training meeting, but they say urgency is one of the signs of a scam. So, fun fact there. Use that knowledge how you will. The overall potential of the United States and its NATO allies is so much greater than that of Russia that there is no doubt of the West's abilities to defeat a conceivable Russian military, even assuming Russia fully absorbs Ukraine and Belarus. But as Americans consider the cost of continuing to help Ukraine fight the Russians in the coming years, they deserve a careful consideration of the cost of allowing Russia to win. Those costs are much higher than most people imagine. I'm sure of it. I'm sure a united Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine is going to send my civilization to a tail spiral that it isn't already in, and that Russia will be solely responsible for. But let us
If
continue.
this article were true, if this article were true, Putin would not be in power.
Oh, absolutely not. No.
It's such a preposterous article, and the West is contradicting itself.
Yes, within just the first opening paragraphs here.
Right, and it could be like the amount of losses is a projection of their own losses.
Naturally, of course, as one does. So, to continue, to deter and defend against a renewed Russian
Go ahead.
threat following a full Russian victory in Ukraine, the United States will have to deploy to Eastern Europe a sizable portion of its ground forces. The United States will have to station in Europe a large number of stealth craft. Building and maintaining the aircraft is intrinsically expensive, but challenges in manufacturing them rapidly will likely force the United States, terribly worded, may I add, to make a terrible choice of keeping enough in Asia to defend Taiwan and its other Asian allies, and deterring or defeating a Russian attack on a NATO ally. The entire undertaking will cost a fortune, and the cost will last as long as the Russian threat continues, potentially indefinitely. That's the only true statement in this article so far.
Yes.
Almost any other outcome of the Ukraine war is preferable to this one. Helping Ukraine keep its lines where they are through continuous Western military support is far more advantageous and cheaper for the United States than allowing Ukraine to lose. Freezing the conflict is worse than continuing to help Ukraine fight. That would simply give Russia time and space to prepare for a renewed war to conquer Ukraine and confront NATO. So is the implication there that NATO is incapable of keeping pace with Russia, despite the fact that you said the combined might of NATO and the West could outpace Russia? Would a freeze not give as much, if not more, advantage to the West under their own logic?
I know this makes no sense. So Russia's lost nearly 1 million men. 1 million men. It is outnumbered 11 or 12 to 1 by the EU, right? So, um, I mean, they're really trying to square the circle here that the Russians have completely underperformed. They've lost 1 million men, and well, then there's nothing to worry about, right? But notice how subtly what they're implying is the old trope that the Russians are they're slaves, they're anti-democratic. They're deep down inside they only respect the autocrat, and
They're the
it's not
living
mentioned, but that's what they're.
continuation of the Mongol Empire.
Yes, 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 and so that's not said, but I think that's implied. Most readers will not even notice that.
Oh no, it's the stupid tropes that
I
they
don't even
that
know if
they.
the author does.
Yeah, I mean, the between that clown car, I mean, I'm sure one of them might have come to that conclusion, but that's even a bit of a stretch. Helping Ukraine regain control of all or most of its territory would be much more advantageous and would drive the Russian forces even further to the east. Best of all, supporting Ukraine to its victory and then helping it rebuild would put the largest and most effective, friendly military on the European continent at the forefront of the defense of NATO, whether Ukraine or does not ultimately join the alliance. All of these scenarios should keep Americans should keep in mind that Ukraine is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan in 2001 was one of the poorest countries in the world with no industry to speak of and a poorly educated population. Ukraine is, or shall I say was, highly industrialized with a modern, urban, and highly educated population. That seems to be fleeing the country in record numbers, might I add. Restored to its 1991 borders, they they're under the delusion that they're still going to retake Crimea, and that would not lead to a
Yeah,
nuclear
yeah.
war. I don't know where these people are coming from. I don't know how self-aware they are. I don't know how much of this that they know they're bloviating. But once again, if I keep doing this, we're going to be here all day. So I'll try to minimize the commentary for now. Restored to 1991 borders, Ukraine's economy is large enough to support its own military. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, or as one of my friends calls him off air, Volodymyr Zelensky. I'm sorry, I had to. Has recently committed his country to establishing its own industry, including establishing joint ventures with Western firms to benefit Ukraine and its partners. A victorious Ukraine would not be a permanent war to the West. It would instead be truly independent and contribute greatly to NATO's security and the West's economy. Following maps illustrate the four military situations to this war and its outcomes. Consider their military, strategic, and financial implications to the United States. So, allow me to just pull up this the maps here for scenario one. So, let me go ahead and save these stupid maps. So that one is pre-war, and this one is scenario one. Let me just get these up on the. I I'm losing it, man. I'm. Let me just get this stupid. This is this is the greatest piece of comedy I think I've ever read right here, and we're not even we're not even halfway through it. So, and I actually I had come across this article while doing the show, so unfortunately I did not have time to prepare this, and these maps are also massive, so hopefully I can scale this down to the size where you can actually see it on screen. So there is the February 24 map, and this is so we'll have the map. Okay, and then that should do it right here. So everyone should be able to see those now. So as it were, before the full-scale Russian invasion of February 22, the non-Baltic NATO states faced no serious conventional military threat from Russia. The Russian ground forces had one airborne division and mechanized infantry brigade near Estonia and Latvian borders, and the equivalent of a division in the exclave of Kaliningrad, which is physically separated from Russia and a poor launch pad for its own attack on Poland and Lithuania, which it borders. The next closest Russian forces were to Poland were about 360 miles to the east on the far side of Belarus. No Russian troops threatened Slovakia, Hungary, or Romania. The Russians have been building an air defense network relying on their advanced S-300 and 400 long-range anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems to hinder NATO's ability to defend the Baltic states. They have been expanding that network over much of the Black Sea, using their bases in occupied Crimea. However, their networks have suffered from a large gap across southern Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania because they could not base their systems in Ukraine. Even their air defense coverage over Poland relied heavily on the systems in Kaliningrad, the most vulnerable and exposed part of Russian territory. Kaliningrad's small size deprives Russian air defense systems of one of the important elements of their survivability, in fact. The systems are fully mobile on all their components and mounted trucks. They're designed to move around and thereby make it harder for an adversary to locate and destroy them. Trapping these systems in a small exclave reduces that advantage and facilitates NATO efforts to disrupt and defeat them. And you can see on the right-hand map the supposed position of Russian air defenses here. So we will pull up the map of the current situation of Ukraine to go along with the next paragraph here. So we'll go ahead and get that up. And let me just get that resized so everyone can see it. Okay, so this is the disposition as of December 12th, 23. So to continue on the article, Ukraine's defeat of the initial Russian invasion in 2022 has kept its eastern borders of Poland and Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania free of the threat of major Russian ground attack. Ukraine's liberation of the western Kherson Oblast has also kept the nearest effective Russian troops about 220 miles and a large river away from Romanian border. Most of Russia's troops are more than 350 miles from Romania and still further from Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. The war is fully occupying nearly 500,000 Russian troops, just about all of Russia's available ground combat power. The Russians are steadily completing their long-running efforts to secure control over Belarus and to base Russian forces there. But Russia still poses no conventional ground threat to NATO today because its military is tied up in Ukraine. Very interesting admission there that
Mm-hmm.
Russia is not a threat, but if we fail to act, Russia will be a threat. Once again,
Yes,
it's this
yes,
unfalsifiable statement. Russia is constantly this looming threat. There's nothing that can be done to defeat them except support Ukraine, and what they're admitting has to be a perpetual conflict if we're following their own logic. One thing I
yes.
also like here is they keep mentioning the borders of Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. And Hungary, which they have touted as a Russian puppet state for years now, ever since Orban took power,
Mm-hmm.
why would they be under threat of Russian forces? Why would that be a concern? Is there something they're not telling us? Is there some sort of narrative they're trying to construe? Look, I'll refrain from my own commentary on that, but I do think that that is an uh, interesting choice of words, an interesting way that they're
Mm.
framing this. So this is going to be the hypothetical map if Russia wins. So we'll go ahead and get that up
Mm.
here.
Oh, yes, I remember this. Oh my
Like I said,
God.
I'm sure you've seen all these because they're just absolutely
Yes, I
absurd.
have. Yeah.
I mean, this has been blowing up on Telegram, so I'm sure most of you already seen this, but I still feel a duty to show the people what is being shoved down their throats here. So we'll go ahead and pull that. And it's so absurd. I'm sorry. It's just it's so stupid. Okay, so this is the map that they want us to believe here. So map 3 is a hypothetical situation if Russia fully occupies Ukraine. So, the following estimates of Russian forces might deploy to Ukraine and Belarus if Moscow intends to be fully prepared for a short notice serious attack on NATO is very conservative. It assumes that the Russian move on NATO's to borders, two armies newly created, one for the current war, one which is already being designated station in Crimea, and two others which are deployed on the eastern borders of Ukraine and Belarus, whose stationing at those local locations will lose strategic purpose following a full Russian victory in Ukraine. It assumes that most of the Russian army currently in Ukraine will return to bases within the current boundaries of the Russian Federation after the war. Most of the Russian army's home stations are Soviet era garrisons whose locations are not optimized for Russia's current strategic context. The Russians could well bring considerable combat power towards the NATO frontiers, then discussed below and depicted on the map following a victory over Ukraine without any strategic cost if they were to willing paying the financial price, etc., etc. So the sudden collapse of Western aid would likely lead to sooner or later to the collapse of Ukraine's ability to hold off the Russian military. Russian forces would push all the way back to the western Ukrainian border in such a scenario and establish new bases along the borders of Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and Hungary. The Russians are preparing occupation military to handle the almost inevitable Ukrainian insurgency while leaving its troops on the front line of free NATO. I mean, we're talking insurgency. I mean, that's mostly going to be out of the the west and the Galician region, which I don't think Russia has any intention to occupy. But of course, that's required for the narrative here. And once again, I don't even think the Russians want control of Galicia. But I'll continue here.
Yeah,
The Russian.
strong doubt.
No, it's far too entrenched in this Ukrainian identity in order for them to. Most of the rest of Ukraine, within a generation or two, they could turn around. They could, uh, as we've discussed, with the fluidity of Ukrainian identity, they could very easily roll back the clock on that. But to continue, the Russians have expanded their army structures to fight the war and have indicated their intentions of retaining a large structure after the war. They could readily station three armies: the 18th Combined Arms, the 25th Combined Army Arms, and the newly created for this war 8th Guards Combined Army Arms on the border of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. They would likely build out the component divisions of those armies to normal complements of these three regiments each, drawing on formations further in the rear to bring these frontline units near to their full strength of roughly 6 mechanized division, 18 regiments in Ukraine. They could move divisions that had been stationed in eastern Ukraine's border into Ukraine itself as reservists on the front line divisions. The Kremlin has made great strides in the long term to protect and a project to gain control of the Belarusian military, and victory in Ukraine likely would get it the rest of the way. The Russians would likely deploy permanently or nominally rotation away an airborne division and a mechanized infantry divisions in southwest and northeast Belarus as well. They would be able to threaten on short notice mechanized offensive against one or several NATO states with at least 8 divisions backed by significant reserves, including the 1st Guard Tank Army, which would be reconstituted around Moscow and always intended to be the premier strike force against NATO. They could make such an attack and still threaten the Baltic states and Finland with forces already present and reinforcements that they announced intend to station along the Finnish border. Russian ground forces would cover a dense air defense network of S 300, 400, 500 long range missiles and anti missile systems, while overlapping coverage of the entire front. NATO would be unable to defend against such an attack with the force in Europe. The United States would need to move large numbers of American soldiers to the entirety of NATO's eastern borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea to deter Russian adventurism. Oh, adventurism, you say? And be prepared for a Russian attack. The Russians would also need to commit a significant proportion of its fleet stealth aircraft permanently to Europe. NATO defense strategy relies on air superiority not merely to protect NATO troops from enemy attack. NATO defense strategy relies on air superiority unless you're Ukraine. Oh, that's a touchy subject there. From enemy attack, but also to use their air power to offset smaller NATO ground forces and limited stocks of NATO artillery. The United States would also have to keep a large number of its stealth aircraft available in Europe to penetrate and destroy Russian air defense systems, and to keep Russians from reestablishing effective air defenses so that non-stealthy aircraft and cruise missiles can reach their targets. The requirement to control such significant stealth fleet to Europe could badly degrade America's ability to respond to Chinese aggression in Taiwan, since all Taiwan scenarios rely heavily on the same stealth aircraft that would need to defend Europe. The cost of the defensive measures would be astronomical and would likely be accompanied by a period of high risk where U.S. forces were not adequately prepared or postured to handle either Russia or China, let alone both together. Now, that is an interesting statement that they have here, getting to this article, that we either need to deplete ourselves of military resources in Ukraine or divert military resources from Asia to Europe in the event of a Ukrainian defeat. However, in order to sustain the Ukrainian war effort, we likely would also have to divert resources from our Asian front in order to support Ukraine, which puts us in the exact same scenario, which they have yet to explain how it doesn't. But
Yeah.
I'm trying to make too much sense of this article, I think. So we'll go on to the next map, projecting full Ukrainian victory. So I'll go ahead and save this map right here in order to share at least what their projections are. This is This is so absurd, but I'm intrigued by how ridiculous it is, frankly. So we'll go ahead and show the map right here, showing the event of a Ukrainian victory, which I'm sure is going to be a very unbiased look at Ukraine's capabilities and what it might mean if Ukraine wins. So, to explain this map, according to the Institute for Study of War, reestablishing Kyiv's control over all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, is important for the United States and NATO, as well as Ukraine. Russia's possession of Crimea makes Russia the dominant power in the Black Sea and allows Russian aircraft to threaten southeastern NATO flank as well as deploy long-range missiles on the peninsula. The position in the east, left bank of Kherson Oblast, that the Russians currently control provide bases even further to the west of Crimea. NATO will have to meet the challenges whenever the war ends if those areas remain in Russian hands. If Ukraine regains its 1991 borders, however, the pressure on NATO eases dramatically. The nearest Russian troops to Romania would be almost 500 miles away. The Black Sea would be very nearly a NATO lake. Moscow would likely complete its military control of Belarus and base its forces there, even in this scenario. The threat of NATO, the threat to NATO of such bases, however, would take on a very different cast uh, in a scenario in which Belarus is a larger salient, which NATO forces on two sides, and a large and powerful independent Ukraine along the southern border. The task of defending northeast Poland and the Baltic states from Russian troops operating on Belarus and Kaliningrad and Russia itself is a much more manageable and less costly proposition to that of defending the entire NATO line from the Black Sea to the Arctic Ocean. Once again, they don't explain the scenario in which this
Mhm.
can be achieved. And it just throw more arms at Ukraine. It it fails to adequately explain what can be done here. But let us read the conclusion to get a better idea of where this article is going. The brief paper evaluates that only the narrow question of some of the military, strategic, and financial trade offs of various possible outcomes of the Russian war in Ukraine. We've considered other important questions as the possible Russian escalations of the face of defeat, and we do not minimize those considerations. Sure, you don't. We've also argued strongly that American values align with American interests in Ukraine, and that there's a strong and cogent values based argument for helping Ukraine liberate all of its land and its people. We still believe that is true. But the American people are being asked to spend a lot more money helping Ukraine fight Russia, and it's not unreasonable for them to also wonder what the financial cost of not helping Ukraine would be. This essay is meant solely to serve as a departure point for a data driven and realistic discussion on answering that question. And then there's a few side notes about the maps that I'll spare you because I think I've tortured all of you long enough with this. But GSP, I'll pass it to you. Any initial thoughts on this little article that we just enjoyed?
Well, I mean, I look at this article as a kind of a summation of other articles, whether it's the Financial Post, what the Washington Post, even stuff like the Daily Mail echoes this, Bild, Der Spiegel. They're all basically kind of saying the same thing, right? Um, Russia's lost a lot. I know that makes you happy. Russia's lost a lot of men and material, right? Okay, that's the good news. But they're very powerful now, very, very powerful. And there was an article that said the by the Washington Post back in early December, I think December 2nd, saying the shift in Russia is unmistakable. And it's an article that basically says that the Russian people really do support Putin, and the economy is doing very well, and so on and so forth. So this article kind of like it gathers all these other statements and does its own cogent expression of why, yes, we've done great harm, but if we just spend more money, we'll eventually defeat them. But it belies the underlying logic that even if you kill a million Russians, they're still going to come at you. So which one is it?
Yeah, they're
Just a,
manufactured like orcs.
j-
That's
yeah,
the narrative that they want you to
just
believe.
100 million more, and we'll win. I don't hear how that's supposed to happen, right? Like, ultimately, they don't want to go in. Ultimately, Europe does not want to join the war. What they're really saying is just give the money, okay? Like, we've got to pass the money and we have to be okay with it, because we're going to have to go in if we don't, and we don't want to go in. That's really what these articles are all about, right? All the stuff about how many men Russia actually lost, what their capabilities really are, whether they support Putin or not, blah blah blah. Again, like, that is quite secondary or tertiary. Like, what they're really talking about is, we don't want to go to war with Russia, and if we don't give more money, we will. Now, of course, there have been voices that are not those. I mean, some politicians have said it, but some generals have said it in NATO. Um, and then you have total disgruntled assholes like Milley saying, all Russians should be afraid of going to bed and wondering whether their throats will be slashed or not.
Far
So
beyond
he's
the
basically
rhetoric
saying,
of even any of the world wars in a nation that we're not even officially at war with.
exactly, 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 exactly. Like, the fact is the U.S. hates Russia in a way they never did Nazi Germany. Like, as you said, you never heard this kind of rhetoric, but
This goes even
it's also
beyond
kind
Cold
of,
War rhetoric too. This
oh
is
yeah, way
unprecedented.
beyond Cold War rhetoric. Yes, no, they want like a final solution for Russia. They want what they want for Russia is what they eventually achieved for Germany, right? They don't want to deal with this problem ever again, and I think they feel that time is running out, and that's part of what's driving them towards this rhetoric. The other reason, of course, they don't want to fight in Ukraine is, the other countries are kind of confident about what Russia is doing. Russia is doing better in 2023 than in 2022, in every respect. I mean, they bought the largest oil refinery in Iraq. That's a major game changer. They'll be in charge of the majority of oil there. This happened about 2 weeks ago. 13 days ago is when I first read about it.
They've made excellent strides with the OPEC countries. They have a
Yes, they have.
practically a corner on global oil supply because of that. Sure, you
And
get
2020,
some pushback from the United States, but when it comes to determining oil, Russia may not be the sole arbiter of that, but
yeah,
they're one of the major players. And
yeah,
look, they
they're
always
not
were, but that has grown exponentially.
right, right. Now, they're using that Zion effect where you're not supposed to take BRICS seriously. You take nothing seriously except not even Russia, but Russia can also conquer Europe. Like, Russia can barely conquer Ukraine, but Russia is also going to take over, is going to go to Poland, right? Um, what they're really not telling you is actually getting Saudi Arabia and Iran to open up their embassies and both joining BRICS is a big deal. The UAE joining BRICS is a big deal. Both those countries giving up on the American dollar is a big deal, because, like, well, you're not going to bomb them the way you did Iraq and Libya for doing the same thing, right? Um, yeah. So,
I also have to add, I think this article does betray some contempt for even NATO allies. So the ones that they kept bringing up, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Ukraine, that they view these countries as backwaters. Now, whether they are or not, aren't I don't think that's relevant to the point I'm trying to make here. But notice how they never say Germany, they never say France, they never say any of the more developed NATO countries. I mean, I suppose Finland, but Finland is also on board with Russia. But they mention Poland, they mention the Baltic states, they mention Romania, they mention Hungary and Slovakia. And fundamentally, although they are subdued, so the threat is pacified, they have the same level of contempt for these nations as they do the Russians. Sure, they might be a bit more closely aligned with the West, but the feelings of disdain haven't gone away. And I know you'd mentioned Germany, but I would say just as much Germany that Poland, that the Baltic states, that's also the model that they want to impose on Russia. And I think if there was any question about that, 2022 and of course continuing in the 2023 made that a certainty that that was the West plan for Russia all along.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes.
And I know I made this joke at the beginning of the article, but what it does feel like in many ways is the Indian scammer saying, "Please give money is urgent. Why not give money?" And then gets mad and berates you for not doing it. And it honestly feels like it's urgent. Give the money. If you don't give the money now, something very bad will happen. Which is, like I said, it's a classic scam, and that's what this really all feels like. Uh, just at the end of it. But I do ultimately think that you're right. It does present a doublespeak of portraying the Russians in a very incompetent light, such as 90% casualties, but also expressing, in a veiled sense, the Western fears of we've seen that they are a combat capable modern military, and we are either not able or not willing to go up against that ourselves, so the onus must fall on the Ukrainians. And you could even say it was veiled in the article, and the other Eastern European states if it comes to it.
Hmm.
But that's all I had for the Ukraine segment. I didn't expect it to take that long, but like I
Hmm.
said, I actually came across this article because I always like to keep Telegram open during the show for any live news updates. I like to stay on top of that kind of stuff, and this one came across. I was picking through it, and I decided it was good enough to read on the show. So I suppose we can round out with some of the secondary news out of Israel that has developed over the past week. And it has been a much calmer conflict, but it is, I shouldn't say calmer. It's been a much more frozen conflict, as it were. But it still continues on. And I do think we're at a point, much like we were, say, in 2018, 2019 with Ukraine, and in Syria for that matter as well, where everyone is waiting for the other side to really fire the first shot in order to justify their further aims. And with the past few weeks, what you do have is a stalling out of the offensive in Gaza. Now, of course, the offensive in Gaza started out in a very, very heavy-handed manner. I don't think anyone
Hmm.
can really deny that. And what continued from there was after they came in with overwhelming force. Once they started to send the ground armies in, once they tried to start ground operations, it very quickly stalled out. Now, whether that's because of actual military considerations or because of political international pressures, we're being honest, probably a combination between the two. I believe that, much like in the U.S., how the Christmas holiday has been canceled for Congress, that the Hanukkah holiday was canceled for the Knesset as well, which is a pretty big leap. I don't think that has happened, at least not in recent history. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there, but that's the level of crisis that we're at right now. But
Yeah, there was actually uh, air defense systems that went off in Jerusalem at the Wailing Wall today. So you had announcers and then people just fleeing from there. Of course, there was Friday night prayers and so on. These are Israel. These are Jews, Israelis that I'm talking about.
yes, and there was also some footage out of Ashkelon with a missile that had failed to detonate that had just crashed through a supermarket, just sitting there uh, undetonated. But in Ashkelon, of course, is right by the border with Gaza, and that's actually where a lot of the initial violence took place. Now, need I remind everyone, because this is something that another point that really needs to be driven home, that you have to remember the Israeli response force with their own helicopters, they didn't make any effort to spare the Israelis either. And there were actually some recent strikes in Gaza that I believe had 3 Israeli hostage casualties as a result of those strikes. 3 Israelis that were being held hostage by Hamas were, I believe, actually all killed because of those. So this is the level it's at. They're not holding back. Now, of course, that's been Israeli policy for years, where they don't take the consideration of their own hostages in the safety of their own hostages into consideration. And the Arab Muslim world has mostly gone silent on it. It still has been a latent conflict, but it has moved more into the background. You actually do see focus shifting back towards Ukraine, even though a lot of the focus towards Ukraine is casting doubt and aspersions on it. Perhaps that I don't know. Perhaps this is a backdoor way of giving Israel free hand to conduct whatever operations they want. But once again, we also have at the same time the White House coming out passing sanctions against certain Israeli individuals and certain Israeli companies as a result of this war in Gaza. Unprecedented stuff, passing sanctions on Israel, because at this point, the Biden White House, the current administration in Washington, is walking on eggshells. We're less than a year out from an election. And when it
Mm,
comes to the proper election cycle, we're going to get the Republican primaries in full in 3 months. We're going to get the start of the presidential debates probably around August or September. But the campaign trail is certainly going to start up, I would say, around May or June in the summer. That's usually when it really goes in the high gear and continue on into November. You have
yeah.
Biden, who has to answer for his foreign policy, being the incumbent, being the guy up for re-election, having to answer for his policies, particularly his foreign policy, which, given how much the world has shifted under him, now there were major shifts under Trump, but I think they all really came to a head under Biden, and that's on top of, let's just say, less than ideal economic performance. The less he has to answer for on both the questions of Israel and Ukraine is the better. So, is he certainly cutting them off? No, but it's once again not a very insightful take. But he's yanking the leash as much as he can on them, even though it becomes a very convoluted situation in the case of Israel because of the massive amount of influence Israel has, both in the U.S. government apparatuses, in the media, etc. And you might get a situation where it's speculated to go back in time a little, go back in time about 30 years, that George H.W. Bush was driven out of office because of his insufficient support for Israel. Now, by no means was George H.W. Bush anti Israel, but he did come from an older school in American politics where he was an oil man. He wanted to make deals with the Gulf states, he wanted to make deals with the oil rich Arab countries. So that means he was on very good terms with Saudi Arabia. Um, that is the reason behind the first Gulf War, was to keep the oil access open, the oil trade lanes open, protect Kuwait, another vital American asset, especially from the perspective of oil and resources and what somebody like Bush Sr. would have thought. And a lot of that came at the cost of overt support for Israel. Lo and behold, Bill Clinton gets elected. And what's one of the first things Bill Clinton does in his first term in office? Not one of the first things, but one of his major acts in his first term in office. Signs the act, the bill out of Congress, to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. Now that kind of got kicked down the road until Trump finally implemented it in 2018. But point being is, Bill Clinton, to that point, was probably one of the most Zionistic presidents we ever had. Now that, of course, was surpassed by Bush Jr. Obama was a bit of a strange case. It wasn't really, by no means was anti-Israel, but had a very contentious relationship with the Netanyahu administration. Trump, need I say more? And now we get the situation with Biden, where the world is not what it was in 1992. It's not even what it was in 2020. And he has to make some tough calls. And I do think that the Jewish elite in America are somewhat sympathetic to that. As much as pro Israel as they might be, I think a lot of them, the ones who aren't rabidly Zionist, understand the bigger picture at play here and realize with no America means no Israel. And that if America
Yes.
continues
Yes.
to make these imperial blunders, Now, by no means are they going to become staunch isolationists or non-interventionists, but if America continues to make these missteps abroad, this is not going to be a country that is sufficiently able to guarantee Israel's security as it has in previous years. Whereas, once again, you get the more quote unquote right wing aligned parts of the uh, Jewish influence in America, who are probably going to cast their lots in with people like DeSantis and will be, of course, eventually made to concede to Trump on these issues, where Trump is going to be a much more hardline on these issues. He's going to be much more hardline on the Iranian issue. He's going to pledge full support for Israel, talk about how this would have never happened under my watch, etc., etc. And the ones who have a greater sense of urgency about the situation in Israel, in which case I do think they actually have more are more justified in their thinking than usual, are going to cast their lots in with the right, whether that be Trump, whether that be DeSantis, or whoever it might be, because they're going to put more urgency, more primacy on the issue of Israel. Whereas the ones who are more subdued, the ones who can take a bigger picture, who can divest themselves more, are going to be are going to realize that look, Israel might have to make some concessions in order to survive, and in order for America to be able to properly provide for it in a rapidly changing world. And I do think that's the impasse when it comes to both Israeli influence with how it's governed inside of Israel and with how they conduct themselves abroad, particularly in the United States. That's the calculation they have to make. Netanyahu is the wrong man if you want to go with the former option of biding their time and realizing that Israel doesn't have the blank check that, say, it would have from 2001 to about uh, until present day. Because, mind you, during the Cold War, there were plenty of times when America snubbed Israel because of the bigger picture. Because they realized, look, we can't have you passing secrets to the Soviet Union, we can't have you passing secrets to China, so you're going to need to heal. Post 9/11, American hegemony, war in the Middle East, Israel can do whatever the hell it wants. And we're
Mhm.
coming to an end of that era again, where Israel's having to shift back more to its Cold War era policy, and Netanyahu is the last man in the world for that job.
Yes, I mean there is a feeling that once, I mean, this idea that once this is over, like this will be Israel's. I'm not saying that this is how it's going to go, but this is Israel's last hurrah. After this, Israel can never do this again. And I said it when Gio was on the show. Israel, welcome to being just like any other country. You are no longer the Shvidian exception. You're suffering. Your 6 million has been undone by killing over 6,000 children in Gaza. You did it to yourself, and that's done. I'll give you some like I'll give you there's three examples that I think uh, we'll add as an explainer, right? So one is on December the 8th, there was a teacher at a Georgia public school that was arrested for threatening to cut off the head of a student. His last name is Reese. Um, and he had an Israeli flag in the class. A 13-year-old girl said to him, apparently in the hallway, so she was kind enough not to put him on the spot, that she finds him having an Israeli flag in the classroom offensive. Well, he lost his freaking mind. Okay. There's been lots of eyewitnesses. He threatened to behead her. Notice that they threatened to do it, but they constant like, I just love this. These are evil, horrible people. They're Israelis have had enough, and this is why Europe should take them. Europe send more money. So, guess who's horrible? Anyways, um, so what this tells me, besides the fact that the younger generation is, first of all, there are a lot more brown. They don't have empathy for Israel, and they weren't part of World War II. Okay, so they can't be manipulated. And but the other thing it tells me is that's maybe less easy to figure out is I would say Jews in America have had a sense of power for quite a few decades. Let's say after the last of the great Rockefellers died in 1979, right? And the slightest amount of discomfort, and these people lose their minds. Now, of course, I'm not talking about all the American Jews who have protested in Grand Central Station in New York and all kinds of other places. Of course, people have to understand that. Or when Norman Finkelstein talks about the Jewish oligarch class of America, right? Obviously, uh, right? I'm talking about people that, because of course, this teacher, he said, well, I still have relatives in Israel, right? Reese's, Reese. I mean, I thought that was an English name, so he might be, Jewish on his mother's side, but not on his
Which is
father's
the
side.
only side that counts, and also you do have to account for anglicization and adoption of surnames, etc., etc.
It could be,
Or
but
he could
actually,
just
they
be,
count both sides.
yeah,
I think.
he could just be
Uh,
blowing hot air, but who knows?
in any case, so that was his reason, right? Then you look at Trump. Okay, so this is another example. So Trump wants to move the military outside of Syria, right? And he's denied. Um, Bit by bit, Trump had to realize, like, okay, but like, why can't we get Russia to get rid of ISIS? Why should we do it? They're doing it for us. It's perfect. Why don't we move them out? And okay, fine, I'll lob a few missiles at Assad. He's liberated this territory. He's not dropping barrel bombs anymore. Gradually, I don't know if he ever found out. I mean, maybe he figured it out. But gradually, what he had to learn was no, the reason we're in Syria is for Israel, right? It has nothing to do with ISIS and all these other things. All his argument, all his arguments were reasonable and cogent, and any any fool would have understood them,
Yeah,
right? But
and
eventually,
if
he had to learn that no, it's for the sake of the Israelis that you're there, and the same applies for Iraq, right? Is to stop these countries from ever developing, right? That's the point. Um, the oil is quite secondary to this, right? Now, um, I would say that even is, and my third example is Israeli society has been revealed. No matter how much they hate um, Netanyahu, it does not mean they're against what Netanyahu is doing. 90% of Israelis agree with what they're doing in Gaza. They make no differentiation. And going forward, like, they have to understand that Europe and America are going to get a lot more brown. And a lot of these people are not going to empathize. Even that ghoul, head of the ADL, whatever his name is. I mean, he literally
Greenblatt.
looks. Greenblatt literally looks like Nosferatu. He literally is. He literally is Nosferatu. So I would say that they understand down the road how things are going to go, right? And I mean, we're going to see this struggle, between in the West, but particularly in America, between two different sets of Jews about the question of Israel, right? And the argument, of course, the way they're going to try to woo white conservative Americans will be like, we're going to put the woke away. Like, of course, all of that garbage is really about getting like American white conservatives on board with whatever the latest you know heretical teaching about dual covenants and all that other Schofield nonsense. They want to push,
You know
but
what?
at the
In
same.
all of this, with what we've seen for the past, I don't know, 50 years, let's just be generous.
Yeah,
I hope Israel does get the South Africa treatment. I hope they are forced to tear down those walls and give up those nukes and have to live in an
yeah,
integrated rainbow nation, like they've made
yeah.
all of us. Like how they look,
Yes,
you can
yes,
you can talk
yes.
about how much all day and night how Israel supports South Africa, Israel supports Rhodesia, but they were also the first to drive that knife in their back. Okay, okay, not the first, but once again, the most prominent. It was the worst portrayal you could say because we're so much on your side. Look at all these common causes we have, but once again, at the end of the day, you're that final nail in the coffin, aren't you? And look,
Yeah.
yeah, and from a human cost level, I don't like seeing what's happening in Gaza. It's the massive loss of
Hmm.
lives. But I'm not going to pretend like once again Hamas, the Palestinians, blah blah blah. I realize what they are. But the question I have to ask any Westerner, any European, any North American: what's one more Arab Muslim state in the Middle East? What is it? It's insignificant. A drop in the bucket. What, there's 22, 23 of them as it is already throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Yeah, sure, they'll probably try to come here, and if we actually enforce a border policy, then no problem. But look, I just hope Israel has to deal with South Africa treatment just to get them off everyone's back. Just to get
Yeah,
this
yeah.
country that has been holding the world hostage with its nuclear weapons it claims not to have off its back.
That's right. That's right. Because if they did, they couldn't receive funding according to American law.
And might I add one last point? It is frankly insulting to compare Israel to South Africa. Can you name any instance in South Africa where they engaged in this level
Yeah,
of
and
ethnic
this,
cleansing against
yes,
any of their native African population? Absolutely not. Can you name
yeah.
a time when they threatened to nuke every major capital in the world if the world did not bow to their whims? No, you cannot.
Hmm.
And look, I understand the lefty rhetoric. I understand what they do. Of course, I disagree with it. But to compare Israel to South Africa is frankly an insult to the nation of South Africa, whatever you think about whatever South
Yes.
Africa was pre-Mandela, which, look, it has ups and downs. I'm not going to say it's some great utopia. I would say it's certainly a better state than it currently is, and, there's a number of reasons for that, which you could get into. But at the end of the day, Israel, if any nation, deserves the South Africa treatment. And look, that might be controversial to say, but I'm sorry, they can get screwed for all I care.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get conservative Jews who don't want just like conservative whites in Western countries who don't want any more migration. Even before this, right? Um, but um, now that seems exposed, right? Uh, but it's a tide they can't turn. See, the thing is people will understand the contradiction to, let's say, Israel is allowed to keep this homogeneity, right, and genocide all the people there who, because of course, after they finish with, uh, the Palestinians, anybody else, like people should understand. Just this week there was I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the place. There's so many things I want to say at the same time, but the Gray Zone had a video on Christian Palestinians that are being raided by the settlers. Like the settlers don't care; they hate Christians just as much as
Oh,
they hate Muslims.
the videos from the Armenian quarter were just as brutal as anything you'd
Yeah,
see in
yeah,
the West
that's right.
Bank.
They constantly intimidate them.
And
Um,
all those Hamas militants are Armenian, ethnic Armenian Hamas supporters. It's just so abundant in the Armenian quarter, which has been there for 1,500 years. The Armenian quarter has been there, and once again, that goes back to the various ethnic and political situations at the time. But keep in mind, they have had this small ethnic enclave there longer than most modern nations have existed, and we're expected to throw that into the wind because of the dreams of a few, let's just be honest, members of a Jewish doomsday cult.
right. So the contradiction is plain for everybody. Israel gets to be a homogenous state, and they'll kill 20,000 in 2 months if that's what it takes. But not Europe. And by the way, Europe, America especially, you're going to have to fund it. But your countries, you can't have any homogeneity. For whose sake? Well, for the sake of Jews in those countries who are afraid of homogeneity, right? Like
Gee, I sure
that's
hope all those
that.
Palestinians we dump on your shore don't form a lobby against us. Like, oh, like have they not thought this through? Like,
It's
it's
kind of funny. Like 2016, like a lot of these points are only more salient now than they were then. Like you hear that a bit now, right? Like um it feels a little bit like 2016, and often it's meant in a negative sense. But really, you know, people were making these observations even back then, and now, 7 years later, it's impossible to ignore it. But I would also say that there are of course Jews in the West, liberal Jews in particular, who, let's say, they're old lefty Jews, who they are anti-Zionist, and they don't want what we want for our countries, but they also will. They're some of the most vocal critics of Zionism in Israel, and I was with my nephew last week. In our culture, uh, and he he's technically not my nephew, but in my culture, he is my nephew because someone of my parents' generation who's a first or second cousin, their children, like, um, sorry,
As the Westerner would call it, first cousin once removed, I believe is what you're getting
yes,
at.
first cousin once removed. So I'm talking to him, and like, we went out for dinner, and we ended up in an area of town where there was a protest, and he's just absolutely disgusted. Like, he goes, "No, I don't want to see this." He's furious. Like, he's definitely anti-Zionist, and he's definitely like anti-immigration. I mean, he's in our circle, but um, and I'm trying to tell him, I go, "Dude, you have to think strategically. Like, I get it. You're thinking ideologically, morally, um, but you don't think strategically, right? Like, um, you kind of have to side with these people at this time because, like, you're not going to get rewarded for siding against them without siding for Israel, right? There's no rewards for that.
Yeah, it is a deal with the devil kind of situation where it's an enemy of my enemy sort of thing. Where,
It is.
and like I said, as much as yeah, these people, of course, they want to dismantle Israel's borders, which I have no problem with. They also want to dismantle my borders, Europe's borders, etc., etc. That's what these kind of people advocate for. But you know what? As far as I'm concerned, let them bicker with the Zionist liberals. Let the harder left bicker with the Zionist liberals. Let them be at each other's throats and not at mine.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, it's an argument within this group, and everybody understands now. Just, I mean, it's a lot more people that understand now. I was talking to a young woman from Colombia. Well, she's not. I think she was born here, but her mother's from Colombia. A lot of these people, like, they they kind of they get it. They understand it. Now they're still faithful to their group, so you know they're in. I would say that they are um, maybe not excessively anti-white, but they are aware of divisions that we're talking about right now, and they're aware of their power, but they don't always contextualize it that well because in a way they dislike both groups, us and the Jays, So, but I'm just saying, let's be honest. No one's going to deport all these people.
Well, we find
And if
ourselves in the same struggle as any other people living in a multi-ethnic empire, where you have to make these alliances of convenience.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I mean, I'd like to, but it's not going to happen, obviously, right? And just think of the argument, like, of the inter-Jewish argument, right? That is happening. If 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 Israel can do this, then the West can do this too, right? And if you say they can't, but Israel can, then that privileges Israel in a way that does not make sense, which exposes Jewish power within the West, right? Which reveals it as a polity in charge of the West, but not of the West. And this is the balancing act that they always have to keep in mind, because they're unable to create another base somewhere else in the world,
oh no,
right?
they've tried it in China, they've tried it in Russia, and frankly, I would say if Israel maybe played their cards a little differently, if Netanyahu would have been in power when the Russian war effort started, things might have
Yeah,
gone a little differently. Because Netanyahu, you say what you will about him, but he understood needing to diversify Israel's base of support. He was even willing to shake hands with the Chinese, sign economic deals with the Chinese.
Hmm.
And then you have Bennett in power, who the hell? I don't even to this day I cannot tell you what Bennett's foreign policy goals were. Uh, I don't think that his government was complete disarray.
Status quo. I mean,
Yeah, it was. It,
even Netanyahu never relinquished his fight against Syria.
oh no, no, absolutely not. But point being is Netanyahu had some understanding that there were certain lines he could not cross if he wanted to remain on at least decent terms with these other power blocks. And I do think while he did maintain pressure on Syria, because particularly the Iranian issue, and to a lesser extent the Russian issue, he knew that after a certain point he had to heal. He had to make backdoor deals with the Russians. He had to go to Moscow and he had to negotiate with Putin because of that.
Yeah.
Well, that flew out the window with Bennett. Netanyahu's back in power. Uh, Severe diplomatic damage has been done between Israel and Russia as a result of the war, as Israel's response to the war. While they were not a provider of arms, say, like many other nations were, they certainly didn't go the direction Turkey went, which was something very conceivable that Israel could have done, especially under Netanyahu administration. So that goodwill was completely pissed away, and I suppose that's the story of Israeli foreign policy, just them progressively pissing away what few friends they do have, and then acting surprised when they're left diplomatically isolated.
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. They have friends in America, and that's about it. Like they
Oh,
don't
oh,
really have.
of course, and
Yeah.
that's because they're deep entrenchment. And with America, of course, they can yank the leash on Europe, who will uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
provide a lesser degree of support, as it were. Germany, they have the eternal reparations agreement with, so I suppose that's a constant cash cow. But when it comes to other power players in the world, they isolated India, despite what you see from Indian shills on Twitter. Believe it or not, they do not represent Modi's government. They isolated China, they isolated the Russians, and they also undid 3 years of peace efforts with the Arab states.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what more I can add to the. I mean, the conflict is interesting. I mean, I guess there's a few things we could say. I mentioned on the show last week that 470,000 settlers have left. A country of 9 million. That's a very significant number. You're talking about 10% of the population. Now, of course, we know 10,000 Israelis in just America alone, dual citizens, as part of their mobilization, returned to Israel to create an army of 360,000. Um,
How selfish
but
of them not to offer that combat experience to the Ukrainians. You know what? I'm on Gunther's side with
yes,
this one.
yes, yes, yeah. Uh, I would say, how many Hamas members have they actually killed? I know I said it on the show last week, 1 to 2,000. I think it's less. I personally think it's less. And now we have all kinds of stuff that's being revealed. They've have all these young men, or just any men, stripped of their underwear, marching around, and being forced to carry a gun. See, I told you it was Hamas. He's just carrying a gun in his underwear. The level of propaganda from Israel is so cheap. It's so
Hey,
thoughtless.
I think there might be a few Kalishnikovs hidden under that dialysis machine. Let's go turn it over.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they're not even trying. Like, come on. Like, you guys have a reputation. What's going on?
Let's censor the screen on this clearly Israeli laptop. It's a Hamas
Yeah,
laptop.
yeah.
Those videos were. I mean, so I suppose we're around that time of year. You guys want to start placing your bets on if Israel's going to perform its annual Christmas strike on Syria?
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right.
Um,
We're just days away.
we are days away, and mind you, Israel is so diligent about this. They strike them both on December 25th and January 7th. It's
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
absurd. Like, if you had any doubt of this being like, if you thought this was a coincidence, it's like, okay, they do this several years in a row on both dates. Like, come on,
yeah.
are you fooling anyone? But I guess that is all I had to say. Unless you have any last minute stories to include.
Oh, yes, we do. The total Polish redemption. You know what I'm talking about.
Hey, look,
Oh
I'm
my
just saying it's a
god, my
revolution on both
god.
sides of the Atlantic. You had that one guy in
Mm.
Iowa behead the Bama Fett demon statue, and then
Yeah.
you had the head of the Polish monarchist party take the fire extinguisher to the menorah.
Yeah.
And I also saw an interesting article that circled back to Israel that Israel year after year rejects the proposal to have a Christmas tree in the Knesset. So I suppose it's only fair. Uh,
Yes, yes.
but Poland,
This
a country with like what a Jewish population in like the single thousands, I believe at this point. I,
yeah, like so I sent you a whole bunch of photos. If you want to post them, I think some of
um,
them were they were pretty
yeah,
hilarious. Come
yeah.
on.
Let me
I,
get.
I sent them to you on my other device, so I don't have it. Oh,
Um,
this is horrible. So, after this incident, another Hanukkah menorah in Wrocław was toppled, and an Israeli flag was burned in Poland.
how far the poles have fallen from Paradisus Judaeorum. Yeah, yeah. Once the paradise of the Jews is now not even safe for the most humble of menorah. Man, I'm having trouble finding the pictures too, but they're certainly out there.
I'll
If
hang on.
if you got them, then by all means, uh,
It's just too good. It's just
it is too good.
I
It
can't even believe this this maniac. He actually did this. It's hilarious. But yeah, yeah. So we'll send you this. This is what it was like before. Um, Now, why is it there? Like I thought that there's supposed to be a separation of religion and state. I mean, obviously they're not a church. Notice in the background of this image, is that rabbi. What's his name? He's like very revered. Netanyahu met up with him and he says, "What are you doing about
is that the
those?"
Shabbat Lubavitch guy?
Yeah, he's a Shabbat Lubavitch, right? It's like for the return of the Mashiach, the coming of the Mashiach. So, then there was this. Then there was. So just so people understand kind of what happened, we have this new Lego puzzle that came about.
These are so I'll send I'll post the initial one
Yeah.
here. Let me.
And there's this one from Janusz Korwin Mikke. So I'll send you that. That's beautiful. This is the rabbi. I forgot what his name was. That met with Netanyahu. He's a Lubavitch. You know the Mashiach.
I mean, these people. It's let's resize that one.
I just I just love the face of the woman. After
You know,
after what he's done, it's so hilarious.
this feels like an old Soviet joke about a Polish man extinguishing a menorah. I have to say, as great as this is, I don't think anything will beat this year in terms of these sort of antics of the Dagestani checking the jet engine for any hidden
Yeah,
Jewish
that really was something. You know what's hilarious? The governor of Dagestan is Jewish, and the so-called I know, the so-called
Yevreyskaya.
the Yevrskaya Oblast in Siberia, in southern Siberia. um, which has almost no Jews at all living there. The governor of
Also,
that,
three times the size of Israel.
yeah, yes, and the governor of that oblast is Dagestani. What the hell happened? Wow.
Pootler, you troll.
But that tweet by Corvin that I sent you, that's I had a photo. I don't know what happened to it. I swear I sent it to you. Um, that photo just sums it up. It's after he went and used a fire extinguisher to extinguish the menorah that was there. So
Welcome to Donald Tusk's Poland.
yeah.
I don't remember this happening under
Wow.
Moravecki. You know, the menorahs
Yeah, I,
stayed well lit under Moravecki, okay?
yeah, so
What a
that was
shame. Shame on you, Mr. Tusk, for tolerating this anti Semitism in your country. Shame on you, Mr. Tusk. That's. There's no words. That's honestly that's the best note we've ended the show on in a while. This isn't the normal doom and gloom we end on, so I'll take it. So thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
goodbye and take care.